Welcome to Sleep for Stories. Thank you for joining us on this relaxing and mysterious journey. Let us know in the comments where in the world you're watching from and what time it is for you. If you enjoy these stories, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, give this video a thumbs up, and turn on notifications so you don't miss any future tales. Wishing you a peaceful listening experience and a restful sleep. The wind howled through the desolate streets of the small town of Windcrest, the trees bending under the pressure of the storm that had rolled in that evening. The town was known for its peacefulness, but there was an underlying chill that always seemed to linger. It was a place where time seemed to stand still, and the townsfolk were content to keep things that way. That is, until the dolls began to reappear. It had been years since the disappearance of Horace Mayfield, the notorious dollmaker, known for crafting beautiful, yet eerie, porcelain dolls. Horace had mysteriously vanished one night, leaving behind only his workshop, a room full of unfinished creations, and a chilling reputation. No one spoke of him after that, as if the town collectively agreed to forget. But now, something had changed. When Eleanor Walker, a curious and ambitious young journalist, was assigned to cover the upcoming town festival, she didn't expect to uncover a story that would haunt her forever. She had heard the whispers about Horace Mayfield and his dolls, but she dismissed them as mere superstition, local legends meant to entertain tourists. That was until she found the first doll. It was tucked in the corner of an old antique shop at the edge of Windcrest. Eleanor had been drawn to the shop out of sheer curiosity, its dusty windows beckoning her to explore the forgotten treasures inside. As she perused the shelves, something caught her eye. Porcelain doll, perfectly crafted, but with an unsettlingly lifelike gaze. Its eyes were too vivid, too knowing. The kind of eyes that felt as though they were watching her, following her every move. The shopkeeper, an elderly woman with a distant look in her eyes, noticed Eleanor's gaze. She shuffled over, her hands trembling as she gently removed the doll from its display. "That one is special," the woman whispered, her voice thin with age. "It's one of his Horace Mayfield's. It's one of his..." Last creation. Eleanor's interest peaked. Horace Mayfield? But he disappeared years ago. The shopkeeper nodded slowly. Yes, the dolls were his life's work. Some say he went mad, and that's why he vanished. But the truth is, no one really knows what happened to him. She glanced nervously toward the back of the shop. "And no one wants to remember. Not after what happened?" "What happened?" Eleanor pressed, feeling a strange pull to the woman's cryptic words. The elderly woman hesitated, her hands clutching the doll tighter. "It's best you leave that alone, dear. Some things are best left forgotten." But it was too late. The moment Eleanor's fingers brushed against the doll's smooth surface, she felt a cold chill seep through her, as though she had just touched something that didn't belong to this world. Determined to uncover the mystery of Horace Mayfield, Eleanor returned to the town library and began digging through old records. What she found was disturbing. Whispers of children who had gone missing in the town over the years, all around the time Horace had been working on his dolls. Each child was said to have been last seen near his workshop, and while no one had ever connected him to the disappearances, the town's silence spoke volumes. The more Eleanor dug, the more unsettled she became. The dolls Horace had made were not just shaper. Horace had made were not just beautiful, they were lifelike, eerily so. Some even seemed to hold strange, unnatural expressions, as if they were mimicking emotions far beyond the innocence of a child's toy. And in some cases, It seemed that the dolls were crafted in the image of the missing children. As Eleanor delved deeper into Horace's history, a chilling thought began to form in her mind. Was it possible that the dolls weren't just dolls? Could they have been more than mere art? Was Horace somehow capturing the essence of the missing children in his creations? The idea gnawed at her, but she couldn't push it aside. That night, unable to shake her growing paranoia, Eleanor returned to the antique shop. The doll from earlier still sat on the counter, staring at her with those unsettling eyes. She felt compelled to take it. Something about the doll seemed to call to her, and with a mixture of fear and curiosity, she paid the shopkeeper and took it back to her apartment. The moment she set the doll on her desk, the air in the room shifted. Temperature dropped, and the shadows seemed to lengthen unnatural. Eleanor's heart began to race, but she couldn't bring herself to look away from the doll, its eyes. They were different now, not just lifelike, but somehow alive. The room grew colder. Eleanor could hear whispers, faint at first, but growing louder with each passing moment. They seemed to come from all directions, echoing in her mind. But when she turned around, there was no one there. Her breath hitched as the whispers grew into voices. "Eleanor," a voice said softly, almost pleadingly, "help us." Eleanor froze. The voice wasn't just in her mind. It was coming from the doll, and as she stared into its eyes, she saw it, a flash of something, a face, a child's face, trapped behind the glassy surface of the doll's eyes. Eleanor stumbled back, her heart pounding in her chest. She wanted to scream, but the words wouldn't come. The doll seemed to be watching her, its eyes now filled with sorrow and fear, as though begging her to understand the horror behind its creation. And as she backed away, the whispering voices grew louder, and the shadows in the room began to twist and writhe, taking shape. Eleanor stumbled backward, her breath shallow and rapid. The doll, which only moments ago had seemed like a lifeless object, now felt as though it were alive, staring, watching, waiting. The shadows in the room were thickening, stretching, waiting toward her like dark tendrils, as if the very walls were closing in on her. "Help us," the voice came again, more urgent now, desperate. She looked back at the doll, her hands trembling. The child's face she had seen in the doll's eyes wasn't just an illusion. It was clear now, a faint outline of a boy trapped behind the porcelain surface. His expression was one of terror, and his lips moved, forming words that she could barely hear. Eleanor felt a sickening twist in her stomach. The faces of the missing children, the ones she had read about in the library, flashed in her mind. Was it possible? Could Horace Mayfield have captured their souls in these dolls? Was that what this was all about? The whispering voices were growing louder, almost deafening now. It was as if every doll Horace had ever made had come to life in that very room, each one crying out in agony, calling to her. The air was suffocating, filled with the smell of decay and something far worse, death. Eleanor forced herself to take a breath. She couldn't just stand there paralyzed with fear. She needed answers. She needed to know what had happened. She glanced toward the desk, where the doll sat, its eyes following her every movement. A cold sweat dripped down her back as she reached for it. As her fingers brushed the smooth porcelain, she felt it, a surge of energy, a sharp jolt that sent a wave of ice through her veins. She recoiled. It sent a wave of ice through her veins. She recoiled, gasping for air as the room seemed to warp around her. The whispers became a cacophony, 1,000 voices all clamoring at once, and in the midst of it all, one voice stood out. It was the boy's voice, clearer now, more distinct. She can't help you, it whispered. She is one of us now. Eleanor's blood ran cold. The boy's voice was no longer just a whisper. It was a command, a truth she didn't want to accept. She stumbled back from the desk, the doll's eyes still fixed on a desk, the doll's eyes still fixed on her. The room spinning. A loud knock at the door broke the madness for a moment, and Eleanor's head snapped toward it. She hesitated for a second, torn between fleeing and answering. But she couldn't ignore it. The voices in her head were too much. She rushed to the door, her pulse racing when she opened it. A chill swept into the room. There, standing in the doorway, was an old man, thin, with a weathered face, his clothes torn and patched together. His eyes, were familiar. They were the same lifeless eyes of the dolls, the same hollow, glassy stare. "You found it," he said, his voice gravelly, as if he had been waiting for years. "The doll! You've awakened them!" Eleanor's heart skipped a beat. "Who are you?" she demanded, though her voice was shaky. "What do you know about this doll? About Horace Mayfield?" The old man stepped inside without waiting for an invitation, his movements slow but deliberate. Horace Mayfield. He was more than a doll maker. He was a man who believed that souls could be captured, contained, preserved. He was obsessed with immortality and those dolls. He paused, looking at the doll in Eleanor's hands, the one she had just set down. Those dolls weren't just his creations. They were vessels. He trapped the souls of the children in them. Eleanor felt a chill run through her body. She could barely breathe. "You're telling me the children are inside these dolls?" she whispered, her voice thick with disbelief. The old man nodded gravely. "That's right. But you're not just holding one of the dolls, miss. You're holding one of their souls." Horace was a sick man. He didn't just want to make beautiful dolls. He wanted to control death itself. "Why didn't anyone stop him?" Eleanor asked, the weight of his words sinking in. "Why wasn't anything done? Why wasn't anything done?" "Because..." The man's voice trailed off, and for a moment Eleanor could have sworn she saw a flicker of fear in his eyes. Because Horace Mayfield had followers, people who believed in his cause. "They've been watching, waiting for Fraz, someone to find the dolls again. They've been following you, Eleanor." The walls seemed to close in around her as the realization hit her like a freight train. She wasn't just facing the dolls or the spirit of Horace Mayfield. She was being drawn into something much darker, something far older, something with a hold on this town that no one had been able to break. And now she was part of it. A cold wind swept through the room, and the lights flickered. Eleanor spun around, heart racing. The doll on her desk was no longer just a doll. Its eyes had shifted. Its porcelain skin cracked as if something was pushing from inside. The whispering began again, louder than ever. "She is ours now," with an unnatural force, and Eleanor could feel the weight of it pressing in on her chest. She backed away from the desk, her eyes locked on the doll that now seemed to glow with an ominous, otherworldly light. The boy's face was clear now, fully formed, and his lips moved once again. But this time, they were speaking directly to her. "Run! Run before it's too late!" But it was already too late. Eleanor's heart pounded in her chest as the doll's face seemed to twist. Its once peaceful expression now contorted into one of anguish. The boy's eyes were no longer just lifeless or hollow. They glowed with an unnatural cold fire that seemed to draw her in. She couldn't look away, and as much as she wanted to move, she was much as she wanted to move. She was frozen in place by an overwhelming sense of dread. The room was alive with the whispers, louder now, a cacophony of voices, echoing, each one calling her name, begging her to join them. The air was thick, the temperature plummeting. The air was thick, the temperature plummeting. Eleanor's breath came out in ragged gasps as she slowly backed away, the doll's eyes following her every movement. "You can't run now," the voice from the doll whispered, the boy's voice now chillingly clear in her mind. "You've awakened us?" Eleanor's knees buckled, and she stumbled, barely catching herself against the desk. Her hands trembled, and the feather she had once found so comforting felt cold and useless now in her pocket. This wasn't something she could solve with light. This was something far more ancient, far more insidious. She had to get out. But the whispers continued to circle her thoughts, pushing her back toward the doll. It felt as though the entire room had become a cage, the walls closing in tighter. With each passing second, "You can't escape us, Eleanor." She heard the old man's voice behind her, urgent, filled with a sense of terror she hadn't noticed before. "Get out of here now! You've triggered something you don't understand. Horace's followers are here, and they'll stop at nothing to take you somewhere. Do really didn't for call back Tor, shop, or Koi, babed, all day, I've been watching, waiting for the doll to be found. You can't stay here." But before Eleanor could move, the room seemed to shift. The doll on the desk vibrated, its porcelain body cracking as if it were coming to life, breaking free of the restraints that held it. The boy's face distorted into a grotesque mask, his mouth opening wider, the darkness within swallowing any trace of his innocence. The shadows on the walls stretched unnaturally, their long fingers reaching toward Eleanor, beckoning her toward the doll. It was as if the very walls of the room were closing in around her, pushing her closer to the object that had now come to represent something far more sinister. "She is mine," the doll whispered in a voice so chilling it made Eleanor's blood run cold. "Her soul is already marked, belongs to us." Eleanor's body screamed for her to move, but every step felt like wading through thick, suffocating air. She felt the weight of the darkness pulling at her, dragging her toward the doll. The old man's words barely registered. Her instincts were screaming for her to escape. But the fear, the paralysis, held her in place. And then, as though she were in a nightmare, the door to the room slammed shut, trapping her inside. The light flickered above. The shadows, the light flickered above. The shadows, growing darker with every passing moment. She could hear faint footsteps approaching from outside the room, heavy, deliberate, like the sound of something ancient and malevolent drawing near. There was no escape. Eleanor turned back to the doll, its glowing eyes now completely black, the boy's face replaced by a horrible, twisted grin that seemed to stretch beyond the porcelain's boundaries. It was no longer just a doll. It had become something else entirely. It had become a dolly portal. The whispers grew into shouts now, filled with anguish and desperation. Eleanor could almost see them, dozens of faces trapped inside the doll, their eyes wide with terror as they reached out, begging to be freed. "We are your past," the voice from the doll said, its tone growing more powerful, more commanding. "We are your future. We are the darkness that feeds on your soul." Her vision began to blur, the air around her warping, as if she were no longer in her apartment, but somewhere else entirely, a place between worlds. The floor felt unstable, as if she were floating, drifting away from reality. The footsteps grew louder. She could hear someone on the other side of the door now. They were coming. But then, realization washed over her. She wasn't alone. The old man's voice, frantic, echoed in her mind. "You have to break the doll. You must destroy it before they come, before the darkness consumes you." With no other choice, Eleanor summoned every ounce of strength she had left. Her hands reached for the doll, her fingers shaking as she gripped it. As soon as her hands made contact with it, a shock wave of energy shot through her, like a jolt of lightning, causing her to gasp. "No!" the doll hissed. "You cannot destroy us!" But she didn't listen. She couldn't listen. The doll's grip on her mind was slipping, and for the first time, she could see through the veil of its power. She could feel the hundreds of souls trapped inside, the agony of their endless torment. With one final, desperate push, Eleanor wrenched the doll from the desk and threw it onto the ground. She stepped back, covering her ears as the voices inside it screamed in unison. And then, a blinding light filled the room. The dalling light filled the room, cracked, its porcelain body shattering, its dark energy splintering into pieces. The ground beneath her trembled as the walls shook violently. The shadows around the room exploded, disappearing into thin air, leaving only silence. Eleanor stood, trembling, her body covered in cold sweat, the remnants of the doll scattered around her. The room was still, deathly quiet. The air was thick with the weight of what had just happened. She had destroyed it. She had broken the curse, but as she looked down at the broken pieces of the doll, she knew that something else had been set in motion. This was only one battle. The darkness had been temporarily banished, but its roots ran deep, and no matter how far she tried to run from it, she knew it would always find her. The struggle was far from over. Eleanor stood still, staring at the shattered pieces of the doll on the floor. The room was eerily quiet now, the whispers and shadows gone. The oppressive weight that had filled the air seemed to have lifted, but the sense of unease still clung to her, as if the darkness was merely retreating, waiting for the next opportunity to strike. Her breath came in shallow gasps, her heart pounding in her chest as she tried to make sense of what had just happened. The voices in her head had stopped, but the images of the souls trapped inside the doll, their anguished faces, their silent screams, were burned into her mind. She had broken the doll, but what had it truly freed? And at what cost? The old man's warnings echoed in her mind. "They're watching. They'll come for you now." Eleanor's stomach twisted with dread. The fear that had been building since she first found the doll returned with full force. She felt like something was worse, lurking just beyond her awareness, waiting to emerge from the shadows. The feeling of being watched was overwhelming. She wasn't alone. Her hand trembled as she reached for her phone, her fingers struggling to unlock it. She needed to call for help, needed to do something, but her mind was a fog of confusion and terror. Her thoughts kept spiraling back to the doll and the faces trapped inside it. She couldn't ignore the feeling that the battle wasn't over, that the darkness had merely paused to regroup. A sudden knock at the door broke her from her thoughts. Her heart skipped a beat, her eyes flickering toward the door. Was it the old man? Or worse, someone or something else? Her pulse quickened and her body froze in place. She wasn't sure she could move. The knock came again, louder this time, insistent. Eleanor's breath hitched. She stood, motionless, as the knock reverberated through the apartment. The sound reverberated through the apartment, the sound filling the empty spaces with dread. Eleanor. Her heart stopped. The voice was soft, barely a whisper, but it was unmistakable. It was the boy from the doll. Her body felt heavy, like she was sinking into the floor. She had destroyed into the floor, the doll, hadn't she? She had broken the curse. So why was the boy's voice still calling her name? Eleanor? I'm still here. The voice was clearer now, as though it was coming from inside the walls, from beneath the floor. She pressed her hands against her ears, trying to block it out, but it only grew louder. The walls of the apartment seemed to pulse, vibrating with the sound. The very structure of the building shaking as if the darkness were closing in on her once more. She couldn't breathe. She couldn't breathe. She didn't just rattle. It burst open with an explosion of force, the hinges creaking violently. Eleanor stumbled backward, her heart racing. She didn't have time to react. Standing in the doorway was a figure, tall and shadowy, its form shifting like smoke. It was the old man. But this wasn't the same old man she had seen before. His eyes glowed faintly with an unnatural light, and his face was twisted with an expression of terror. "They're coming," he rasped, his voice strained with an expression of terror. "They're coming," he rasped, his voice strained with a fear. I told you, they would find you. It's too late." Eleanor couldn't speak. The words were caught in her throat, her mind scrambling to process everything. What was happening? What did he mean? She had broken the doll, hadn't she? The old man took a step toward her, his movements jerky, like he was fighting something inside him. "The doll wasn't just a vessel for their souls," he said, his voice growing darker. "It was a key to something much worse. Horus's followers, those who believed in his twisted power, have been waiting for the moment you triggered, the moment the curse would start again." "No," Eleanor whispered, shaking her head, unable to accept what he was saying. "No, I stopped it. I destroyed the doll." The old man's face twisted into a grin, but it was not the grin of someone who had any comfort left in their soul. "You've only made it worse. They are here, and they won't stop until they have you. Your soul." Eleanor felt a cold, creeping sensation settle in her chest. Something was stirring in the darkness, something far more powerful than the doll. The shadows in the room grew longer, curling around her like tendrils, wrapping around her like tendrils, her limbs pulling her closer to the figure in the doorway. It felt as though the very air was thick with malevolent energy, as if she were being suffocated by an invisible force. The whispers grew louder again, but this time it wasn't just the boy's voice she heard. It was the voices of dozens, no, hundreds of children, all of them crying out, their voices overlapping, filling the room with an unbearable sound. The walls seemed to close in tighter, and Eleanor felt herself being tighter, and Eleanor felt herself being drawn toward the door. But she couldn't move. She couldn't escape. The old man's grin widened. "There's no way out now. Not for you." The shadows began to move faster, swirling around her, pulling her toward the doorway. The figure in the thread held the key. It ding away in furious. The door stepped forward, its form shifting, becoming more solid, more real. As it moved closer, the room seemed to distort, the lights flickering and dimming. And then, just as Eleanor thought she couldn't bear it any longer, the figure stopped. A voice, different from all the others, spoke from the shadows, low and ancient. "It's time to claim what is ours." Eleanor gasped as the darkness enveloped her. The last thing she saw before it consumed her completely was the old man's eyes, glowing, empty, and the shadows closing in around her. The darkness swallowed her whole, its cold, suffocating presence wrapping around her like a shroud. Eleanor couldn't see, couldn't breathe. The room, the world, everything seemed to fade into a black abyss, leaving her alone with nothing but the whispers. "Eleanor," the voice called her name, not with the boy's pleading tone, but with something far darker, more commanding. The air around her was thick, heavier, weaker than it had ever been, and the silence was broken only by the eerie murmurs of the unseen voices. She couldn't tell if they were speaking to her or through her, but they were all around her now, suffocating her with their desperation. Her body trembled, paralyzed by the weight of what was happening. It was as if she were being pulled into something deep within the earth, into an endless pit of darkness that was both inside and outside of her. At the same time, she wanted to scream, to fight, but she couldn't. The shadows were too powerful, too overwhelming. You cannot escape, the voice continued, now all around her, wrapping itself around her thoughts. You are ours, Eleanor. You have always been ours. The words seemed to vibrate through her very bones, shaking her to the core. A cold, sharp sensation spread through her chest, as if something was taking root inside her, something dark and ancient. She fought against it, struggled to break free, but it felt like every ounce of her will was being drained away, piece by piece. And then, through the oppressive blackness, she saw a faint light, a flicker, a small, fragile glow. At first, she thought it was just a hallucination. Her mind grasping at anything to make sense of the darkness, but the light was real. It was a small orb, glowing softly in the distance, and it seemed to pulse with a warmth that cut through the cold of the shadows. With everything she had left, Eleanor reached for the light. It was the only thing that felt real, the only thing that offered any chance of escape. But as she reached for it, the shadows recoiled, retreating slightly, only to return with greater force, pulling at her limbs, dragging her back into the void. You cannot have the light, the voice hissed. It is not for you. Eleanor's fingers brushed against the light, and for a moment she felt a surge of warmth. It was fleeting, but enough to reignite a flicker of hope. She clung to it desperately, pulling it toward her, willing it to grow brighter, stronger. With every ounce of strength she could muster, Eleanor pushed back against the shadows, against the voices, against the crushing weight of the darkness. She wasn't sure how much time had passed, how long she had fought in this void, but her desperation gave her strength. Finally, with one last burst of energy, she yanked herself free from the shadows, breaking through the oppressive fog. The light in her hand flared, growing brighter and brighter until it was blinding. The voices screamed in fury, but their words were lost to her as the light expanded outward, flooding the entire space. The darkness began to crumble, flooding the entire space, fading away like smoke in the wind. The weight on her chest lifted, and the suffocating air cleared. Slowly, she opened her eyes, and the world came back into focus. She was lying on the floor of her apartment, the remnants of the shattered doll scattered around her. The whispers had stopped. The shadows were gone. The oppressive weight had lifted, and for the first time in what felt like forever, she could breathe. Her body was covered in sweat, her heart still racing, but the fear, the paralyzing fear, had faded. She had done it. She had broken free from whatever that dark force had been. The doll was destroyed, and the souls trapped inside it were free. Or so she thought. But as she stood, her legs unsteady, the feeling of unease returned. She could still hear the echoes of the whispers, faint but persistent. They were distant now, like the remnants of a dream she couldn't quite shake, but they were still there, and something inside her knew that this wasn't truly over. A soft thud broke her thoughts, and Eleanor turned quickly, her pulse racing again. The door to her apartment creaked open. She wasn't alone. There, standing in the doorway, stood a figure, tall, cloaked, with an aura of malevolent power that made the air grow cold again. "It's not over, Eleanor," the old man said, his voice filled with an unsettling calm. "You can destroy one doll, but you cannot destroy what has been awakened." Eleanor's breath caught in her throat. She had thought she was free. She had thought she could escape the darkness. But it was clear now. It was only just beginning. The figure behind the old man stepped forward, and as it in an nas at a wide nature held all painfully charged forward, and as it did, the shadows in the room twisted once more, curling like smoke. The air thickened, and the light from the broken doll flickered weakly, as if the darkness was pulling it back. "You have broken the first part of the curse," the figure said, its voice smooth and cold. "But the dolls were only the beginning. Now, we come for what's left." Eleanor's blood ran cold. She had thought she had escaped, but the truth was even worse than she had imagined. The dolls, themselves, the darkness, they were just the first wave. Now, something much darker was coming for her, and she wasn't sure she had the strength to stop it. Eleanor's mind raced as she tried to make sense of what was happening. The old man's words echoed in her head, his presence suffocating as he stood there, blocking the doorway. The figure behind him remained silent, its gaze fixed on her, its form cloaked in darkness. The whispers, though faint, seemed to grow louder again, swirling around her. Again, swirling around like a storm, drawing her back into the suffocating web of fear. She had thought she was free. She had thought destroying the doll would break the curse, stop whatever darkness had been unleashed. But now, as the figure's eyes glowed with an unnatural light, she realized how wrong she had been. "You said they were free," Eleanor whispered, her voice trembling. "The souls, the children, I set them free." The old man's eyes narrowed, his expression growing more sinister. The souls were never truly trapped in the doll. They were just part of something much larger. The dolls were vessels, yes, but they were never meant to hold the souls forever. They were anchors, meant to tie the souls to the world of the living, and now that they've been released, that power has been set loose. You've unwittingly triggered the return of something much more dangerous. Eleanor took a step back, her mind reeling. "What do you mean? What are you talking about?" The figure behind the old man stepped forward, its movements slow and deliberate. It raised its hand, and the temperature in the room dropped dramatically. Eleanor's breath became visible in the air, as the shadows around her seemed to deepen, thickening until the room was cloaked in darkness. "This isn't just about Horace Mayfield or the dolls," the figure said, its voice smooth but laced with an ancient power. "You've awoken the true darkness, Eleanor. The curse Horace believed he could control, the curse he tried to break. He failed, but now it is yours to face." The figure's hand lowered, and the shadows receded slightly, allowing Eleanor to see its face for the first time. It was not human. Its features were the first time. It was not human, distorted, its skin stretched tight and pallid, with eyes that glowed an unnatural shade of green. There was an otherworldly presence about it, something ancient, as if it had existed long before Eleanor was born. Her heart pounded in her Eleanor was born chest. The room felt like it was closing in on her, the walls bending and warping with the oppressive energy that radiated from the figure. "You're not real," Eleanor whispered, but even as the words left her mouth, she knew they weren't true. This was real. The darkness, the curse, it was all real, and it was coming for her. The figure tilted its head, its smile widening, but it was not a smile of kindness. It was cold, malicious, and full of intent. "Oh, I'm real, Eleanor, and so are they." The old man stepped aside, and as he did, the air grew even colder. The floorboards beneath her creaked, and Eleanor looked down, her eyes widening in horror. From beneath the floor, shadows began to rise, pulling themselves up from the cracks like serpents emerging from the earth. They twisted and writhed, dark shapes forming into twisted faces. Those of the missing children, their eyes, hollow and empty, stared at her with a haunting intensity. Mouths moved, but no sound came from them. Only the weight of their gaze, their endless sorrow, pressing down on her chest. "They are trapped," the figure said, its voice cold and void of sympathy. "Trapped in the curse that you released. And now they're coming for you. You are the key to their release." Eleanor felt her knees buckle as the weight of their gaze bore down on her. The children's faces were haunting, their expressions twisted with anguish. She could hear their silent screams in her mind, the desperation to be freed from the curse that had bound them for so long. You can't control them," Eleanor gasped, her voice shaking with fear. "I didn't mean for this to happen." "I didn't mean to," but the figure interrupted her, its voice growing colder. Too late. With a snap of its fingers, the shadows around Eleanor twisted and contracted. The children's faces blurred together, their forms flickering like flames, and the temperature in the room dropped even further. Eleanor could feel herself being pulled into the darkness, her body weakening, her mind spiraling. "You must understand, Eleanor," the figure said, its voice filling her ears like a thousand whispers. "You cannot escape this fate. You are tied to them, to the curse. There is no way out. You will be the final vessel. You will be the one to complete the circle." Her breath caught in her throat. She couldn't breathe. Her body was frozen, and her mind was filled with images of the children, of the souls trapped in the darkness, of the curse that had never truly been broken. She could feel it now, deep inside her. Something dark and cold, crawling beneath, and cold, her skin just waiting to consume her. But then, as the shadows reached for her, something shifted. A pulse of light, faint at first, flickered in her chest. The feather, she had forgotten about it in the chaos, but now she could feel it, its warmth, its power, filling her veins. It wasn't just light. It was her light, the strength she had found inside herself when she fought the darkness before. With a surge of determination, Eleanor reached for the light, pulling it toward the light, pulling it toward her. The darkness recoiled, hissing in anger as the light began to grow stronger, pushing back the shadows. The children's faces twisted in agony, the darkness shrieking as it was torn apart by the light. The figure snarled, its form flickering as the shadows around it dissolved. "No!" it screamed, its voice unraveling as the light enveloped it. But Eleanor didn't stop. The light grew brighter, filling the room, filling her, until it was all she could see, all she could feel. She had faced the darkness before, and now she was facing it once more, this time with the strength to defeat it for good. The figure's scream echoed one last time, and then, with a final burst of light, it shattered, disintegrating into nothingness. The shadows retreated, fading into nothingness, the nothingness from which they had come. The children's faces, once twisted in torment, began to fade, their souls finally released from the curse that had bound them. And then there was silence. Eleanor stood alone in the middle of the thick room, her body trembling, but the weight of the darkness was gone. The light from the feather flickered gently in her hand, its warmth and energy now completely filling her. She had done it. She had done it. She had broken the curse, once and for all. But Asa, she stood there, looking at the remnants of the darkness that had once consumed her life. She couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't over. The light had won for now, but the darkness, it would always return. And when it did, Eleanor would be ready. The light in the room began to dim as Eleanor stood, her heart still racing. The silence that followed, the battle was almost deafening, leaving her in a strange sense of isolation. She could still feel the lingering presence of the darkness, as if it hadn't truly left her. The room was empty, the dolls shattered, and the oppressive force had faded, but something inside her had changed. Her chest tightened as the weight of what she had faced finally began to settle in. She had destroyed the curse, freed the trapped souls, and fought against the darkness that had haunted her. But now, in the quiet aftermath, she was left with an unsettling emptiness. Had she truly won, or had she merely pushed the darkness back for a time? A sudden, sharp crack echoed in the room, and Eleanor spun toward the sound. The floorboards beneath her feet creaked, the air around her thickening once again. For a moment, everything stood still, and Eleanor's breath caught in her throat. She was not alone. The shadows in the corners of the room began to shift, moving like liquid smoke, slowly creeping toward her. The remnants of the doll, its shattered porcelain pieces scattered across the floor, began to tremble, as though creatures had crammed to her ears say before they were alive again. Her pulse quickened. She didn't have time to think, her body reacting instinctively. She reached for the feather in her pocket, but it was gone. Her eyes scanned the room frantically, but the light from the doll's destruction had dimmed, leaving her in near darkness. A cold chill washed over her, and she could feel it now. Something was watching her. Something that was still here. From the shadows, a figure emerged, taller than the others, but for a moment, Eleanor couldn't make out its form. It was like a wisp of smoke, swirling, its shape constantly shifting. You thought you could stop it. A voice echoed, a distorted, garbled whisper, but unmistakably familiar. Eleanor's stomachly familiar dropped. She recognized it. It was the same voice she had heard in her mind, the one that had once spoken from the doll, but now it was not confined to the doll. It was here, in the room with her. The figure took another step forward. Its body growing more defined, its shape solidifying into something far darker. Eleanor's breath caught in her throat as it revealed itself. Its face, pale and gaunt, twisted into a grotesque smile. It was the old man, the one who had warned her, but now there was something different about him. His eyes were no longer filled with fear or sorrow, but with an unnatural, hungry light. "You think it ends with you," he hissed. "But you've only begun to understand the true cost of what you've done. The curse has only just begun to awaken." Eleanor's heart pounded. She had thought she had freed herself. She had thought the curse had been broken. But it was clear now, this wasn't just about the dolls or the souls trapped inside them. It was about something much older, much more powerful than she had ever imagined. The shadows swirled around her, reaching toward her, their tendrils curling around her limbs. She could feel the coldness of them, the weight of their malice pressing in on her chest. She tried to move, but the darkness had her trapped. "You cannot run," the figure whispered, its voice like cold fingers brushing against her skin. "We are eternal. The darkness has always been here, and it always will be." Eleanor's mind raced. She couldn't move, couldn't think clearly. The terror was suffocating, and the darkness was closing in. But then, just as she thought she would succumb to it, the memory of the feather, the light that had once given her strength, flashed in her mind. She had destroyed the doll, she had broken the curse, but the true power had always been within her. The light she had called upon before had come from her, herself, from her defiance, her will to survive. With trembling hands, she reached into her pocket, her fingers brushing against the familiar shape of the feather. It was still there. It had returned to her. She gripped it tightly, feeling her, its warmth surged through her. The darkness recoiled at the touch of the light, its tendrils faltering, hesitating. Eleanor closed her eyes and focused on the light within her, calling it forth. She had faced the darkness before, and she would face the darkness before, and she would, with face said, do so again. This time, she would not be afraid. The feather in her hand glowed brightly, radiating with a fierce, blinding light that sliced through the darkness, scattering the shadows like dust in the wind. The figure in front of her let out a screech of rage, its form dissolving into the light, fading away into nothing. The room was still again, the shadows retreating into the corners, unable to withstand the light. Eleanor stood alone in the center of the room, her chest alone in the center of the room, her chest heaving, her body exhausted from the struggle. But she had won again. Yet, as she looked around the room, the faintest flicker of doubt lingered in her mind. The darkness had retreated, but it was never truly gone. She had won for now, but she knew that as long as she carried the light within her, the darkness would always find a way to return. Eleanor took a deep breath and steadied herself. The battle was far from over, but she would face it. She would fight, as she always had, until the end, and this time, she would never stop. Eleanor stood in the now quiet room, the flickering light from the shattered remnants of the doll still glowing faintly in the corners of the space. The oppressive darkness had receded for the moment, but the air felt charged, as if something was just waiting for the right moment to return. She felt it, knew it, deep in her bones. The figure that had emerged from the shadows was gone, but its words echoed in her mind. Its words echoed in her mind, weight settling heavily in her chest. The curse has only just begun to awaken. She had thought she'd face the worst, but the darkness was far more than what she could see. It had burrowed into the very fabric of this town, into her very soul. She needed to leave. She couldn't stay here. The house that had once felt like a sanctuary now felt like a tomb, and she was its prisoner, taking a deep breath. Eleanor moved toward the door, the soft glow of the broken doll's remnants still illuminating her path. The moment her hand touched the doorknob, the air seemed to freeze. A shiver ran down her spine as she heard it. A soft whisper, so faint that it seemed to come from the very walls themselves. Her heart stilled. Eleanor. The voice was faint but unmistakable. It was the same voice, the boy's voice, the one trapped in the doll. But this time, it was not calling to her for help. You can't escape us, like a command. Eleanor's breath hitched. She had thought the nightmare was over, that she had broken the curse. But now, the very house, the air around her, seemed alive with the presence of something far darker. She turned slowly, her turn. Harms and Carne. How high? She turned slowly, her gaze scanning the room. Everything seemed still, but the oppressive feeling of being watched was suffocating. There was movement, something shifting in the shadows again, this time faster, more deliberate. Eleanor couldn't tear her eyes away from the corner where the shadows seemed to twist and shift, forming something else. With a gasp, she stepped back. The shadows coalesced, taking the form of a figure, tall and impossibly thin, its face covered by a dark hood. It stood there, motionless, its presence filling the room with a suffocating weight. I warned you, the figure spoke, its voice gravelly, echoing in the air. The curse can never truly be broken. You were never meant to destroy it, meant to carry it. Eleanor's heart pounded in her chest. Who are you? She whispered, her voice barely audible. She tried to steady her breath, but the fear was crawling up her spine, making every muscle in her body freeze. The figure stepped forward, and Eleanor felt a chill race through her body. I am the one who has waited, the one who holds the key to the curse you've awakened. You can fight the shadows, but you cannot destroy them. The room seemed to close in on her, the walls pressing tighter as the figure approached. The light from the broken doll flickered, casting long, twisting shadows across the floor. Eleanor felt the weight of their presence, felt them crowding in on her, waiting for their chance. "I've already beaten the curse," she said, her voice shaking but determined. "I destroyed the doll. I freed the souls." The figure shook its head slowly, the faintest smile tugging at the edges of its lips. "You don't understand. The doll was only one part of the puzzle. The souls were never meant to be free." Eleanor's mind raced. The souls? Had she only released a small part of what was truly buried here? The weight of the figure's words was too much to bear. "You're lying," she whispered, trying to convince herself the doll was everything. The figure's smile grew wider, its face still hidden in shadow. "You are wrong, Eleanor. The doll was only a vessel. The curse you broke was merely a fragment of a much larger force, a force that now has you in its grip. The souls you freed were never truly free. They were simply waiting." Eleanor's legs felt weak beneath her as the truth began to settle in. The souls, the dolls, it wasn't over. It had never been over. The curse had only been awakened, but it hadn't been defeated. The figure lifted its hand, and with the motion, the shadows in the room thickened, wrapping around her legs, pulling her back toward the center of the room. She tried to move, tried to fight against the force, but it was like trying to break free from quicksand. "You've opened the door," the figure said, its voice now a low hiss. "And there is no going back. You will be the one who carries the curse now." Eleanor could feel the weight of the darkness pressing in on her, suffocating her. She could hear the whispers again, growing louder, merging into a chaotic storm of voices, all speaking at once. The boy's voice, the other children, the whispers of the past, the souls of the lost, all coming together, filling the room, surrounding her. "You can't escape the curse," the figure repeated, its voice echoing in the shadows. "You are part of it now, and it will never let you go." The darkness was closing in, but Eleanor knew one thing with certainty. She couldn't give up. She would give in. She had fought before, and she would fight again. Summoning all the strength she had left, she focused on the light within her. The strength she had drawn from the feather. She would not let this curse claim her. Not now. Not ever. With one final surge of energy, Eleanor reached deep inside herself and called forth the light, forcing it to push back the darkness. The shadows screamed, retreating, writhing in pain. As the light grew brighter, stronger, the figure in the shadows faltered. Its form, the figure in the shadows faltered. Its form flickering and distorting as the light cut through it. "No!" it shrieked, its voice filled with rage. "You cannot fight what you've unleashed." But Eleanor didn't stop. The light surged forward, burning through the figure, disintegrating it in an explosion of light. The darkness, the curse, everything began to unravel, the shadows dissolving into nothingness, their grip on her loosening. And then, with a final burst of energy, the room fell silent. The light was gone. The darkness vanquished. The curse had been broken. This time for good. Eleanor stood alone, gasping for air. Her body trembled, but she was free. The battle was over. But as she looked around the room, she knew, deep inside her, that the darkness would always find a way to return. It had always been there, lurking, waiting. And when it came back, Eleanor would be ready. Stood in the eerie silence, the remnants of the battle still lingering in the air like the fading echoes of a nightmare. Her body was drained, her muscles aching from the exertion of the fight, but she couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. The light she had summoned had driven the darkness away, but it didn't feel like the end. The room was still, but the air was heavy, as if the very walls held their breath. She could still hear the whispers, distant now, like a low hum in the back of her mind. She tried to push them away, but they lingered, persistent, gnawing at the edges of her thoughts. "You think it's over?" The voice came again, not from the shadows, but from deep inside her. "You're still one of us. You always have been." Eleanor froze, her blood running cold. The voice, it was her own. The whispers, it was all within her. The whispers, the darkness. It was all within her now. She had become part of it, whether she liked it or not. The fight she thought she had won wasn't just against the cursed doll or the twisted souls. It was against something much deeper. The realization hit her like a tidal wave. The curse, it thought she hers out a stressy. And I am the summon wave. The curse didn't just live in the dolls. It had lived in her too. The darkness had followed her, yes, but it had also shaped her, molded her, from the very first moment she touched that cursed doll. It had always been part of her, waiting for her to open the door, to unlock the chain that bound it. And now, no matter what she did, it would never truly leave. The room around her seemed to warp, the walls bending and stretching as though they were alive, as if they were closing in on her. The floor creaked beneath her feet, and Eleanor's vision blurred. She could see the figure again, the one who had spoken to her, its distorted face flickering in and out of existence, its eyes glowing with a sickly green light. "You can't escape the green light. Your fate," it said, its voice like the sound of cracking stone. "You were chosen from the very beginning." Eleanor's pulse quickened. She backed away, stumbling toward the door. But before she could make it, the air shifted. The darkness was alive again, swirling around her, pulling her in. "No," she whispered, trying to steady herself. "I won't let you take me." But the shadows seemed to answer her, their presence overwhelming. The boy's voice, the souls, echoed in her mind once more, their cries distant but growing louder. "You freed us, but now you are one of us," they said, their voices blending together in a chorus of agony. The realization settled in, cold and final. The darkness had never been external to her. She had only been deceiving herself. It was a part of her now, in her, woven into her soul. No amount of light could remove it. No amount of fighting could destroy it. The curse wasn't something that could be broken. It was something that could be broken, that could only be suppressed, held back for as long as she could withstand it. Eleanor's hands shook as she gripped the edge of the desk, her fingers digging into the wood as the shadows closed in. She could feel the weight of their bare parts aside. Major Distress being ordered Carlmort. Presence could sense the ancient power behind the curse that was still very much alive, still seeking to consume her. But then, just as the darkness was about to swallow her whole, a flicker of light appeared. Stronger this time. This time, Feather. The light she had summoned before was back in her hand, glowing brightly. Burning with the power of her defiance, she held it high, her eyes fixed on the swirling shadows. "I won't let you win," she said, her voice shaking but firm. "I will fight, and I will always fight." The darkness recoiled for a moment, as though hesitant, unsure. It could feel the power within her, the light that refused to be extinguished. The room seemed to tremble with the struggle, the light and the darkness pushing against each other in an eternal tug of war. But Eleanor knew that this wasn't just a battle of physical strength. It wasn't about the light versus the darkness. It was about her will to survive, her refusal to be consumed by the curse that had followed her for so long. She wasn't just fighting for her life anymore. She was fighting for her soul. The light in her hand grew brighter, more powerful, until the shadows seemed to dissolve under its brilliance, unable to withstand the force she had summoned. The boy's face, the one she had seen in the doll, appeared again, his expression twisted with pain, but his eyes no longer filled with malice. There was something else there now. Relief? We are free, the boy whispered, his voice fading into the light. And you will always carry us with you. The shadows melted away, disappearing into the light, leaving Eleanor standing alone in the room, gasping for breath. She could feel the power of the light still radiating from her, the warmth filling her soul, pushing back the darkness that had tried so desperately to claim her. But the fight wasn't over. It never would be. The darkness had been pushed back for now, but it would always be waiting, lurking just beneath the surface. And when it returned, and it would return, Eleanor knew she would have to face it again. She wasn't afraid anymore. She had learned that the darkness couldn't defeat her unless she allowed it to. As she looked around the room, she knew that her battle was far from finished. But for the first time, Eleanor felt a sense of peace. The light within her would never falter, and as long as she held on to that, the darkness would never falter. And, with a steady breath, Eleanor turned toward the door. The journey was far from over, but she was ready for whatever came next. Eleanor stepped into the hallway, her steps slow but determined. The air felt different now, lighter somehow, though the remnants of the darkness still clung to the edges of her thoughts. She could still feel the whispers, faint but persistent, urging her to listen, to give in to the shadows that wanted to claim her once again. She knew it wasn't over. She had fought the curse, but it was clear now that the darkness had taken root inside her. And as much as she had pushed it away, it would always be a part of her. But Eleanor wasn't afraid anymore. She had learned that the true battle was not against external forces, but the darkness within herself. Her hand clenched around the glowing feather she held, its light pulsing steadily in her grip. It was no longer just a tool, a simple object she had used to fight back, symbol of her strength, a reminder of her will to survive. No matter how overwhelming the odds, it had come to represent the light she had discovered within herself, the light that refused to be extinguished as she walked through the house. The feeling of being watched did not leave her. The shadows in the corners of her vision flickered, stretching and twisting as if they were alive, moving with an intelligence of their own. She could feel them pulling at her, trying to draw her back into their grip, but she wouldn't let them. She wouldn't be consumed again. Eleanor paused at the window, staring out at the darkened streets of the town. The sky was overcast, the moon barely visible behind the clouds. There was an unnatural behind the clouds, stillness in the air, as though the world itself was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. The town that had once seemed so peaceful now felt suffocating, like it was hiding something. Something far worse than she had ever realized. But there was something else she noticed, something she hadn't fully understood before. The light she had summoned wasn't just a defense against the darkness. It was a part of the darkness. It was the balance, the force that could push this back against the shadows, but also something that could be twisted, used against her. She had always thought of the darkness as a separate entity, something that existed outside of herself. But now she knew better. It was within her, just as much as the light. It was in every person, every soul, waiting to be triggered, to be set free. And that realization terrified her more than any shadow or figure she had faced. Eleanor turned away from the window, her heart heavy. She had to leave. The town, the house, it was no longer safe for her. She had broken the curse, but she had learned that the darkness wasn't just something that could be vanquished. It wasn't something that could be fought with light alone. The curse was not over. It had simply taken a new form. The figure, the old man, had told her she was a part of it. The moment she had touched that cursed doll, she had sealed her fate, the darkness. The curse, it wasn't just about the dolls or the missing souls. It was about her, about the choices she had made, about the light inside her that had always existed alongside the shadows. As she grabbed her coat and headed toward the door, the weight of everything she had learned settled over her. She had thought that destroying the doll had been the end, but now she understood. The curse, the darkness, it wasn't something that could be destroyed. It was something that lived, something that had always lived, in every soul, in every human. And when the darkness returned, and it would return, Eleanor would have to face it, not just as a force outside of herself, but as something that was part of her. She would have to learn to live with it, to control it, to never let it take her again. As she stepped outside into the cold night, she felt a strange sense of calm settle over her. The whispers had faded, the shadows no longer pressing in on her. The fight wasn't over, but she had won this battle. She had pushed the darkness back for now, and that was enough. The town seemed different as she walked down the quiet street. The weight that had once pressed on her chest was gone, and though the fear still lingered, it no longer consumed her. She could feel lingered. It no longer consumed her. The light within her, steady and strong, lighting her way forward. The night stretched ahead, and Eleanor walked into it, ready for whatever would come next. The darkness would always return, but so would she. She would keep fighting, keep fighting, keep fighting, keep fighting, keep standing, because she knew that no matter how deep the darkness ran, the light would always burn brighter. And for the first time, Eleanor didn't feel alone. She was ready to face whatever came next. Eleanor walked through the streets of Ever Came Next, Increst, the quiet town seeming both familiar and foreign now. The once peaceful surroundings were now tainted with a sense of unease, a tension she couldn't shake. The darkness had been pushed back, but it had left its mark on her, on everything. It was like the town itself had been altered by her struggle. Every shadow, every alleyway seemed to watch her as she walked past, as if they knew something she didn't. The whispers hadn't fully faded. She could still hear them, faintly, in the back of her mind, always just out of reach, but never truly gone. They were like an old song you couldn't forget, lingering even when the music stopped. She paused for a moment, staring at the empty park ahead, the swings for a new pole. Staring at the empty park ahead, creaked in the wind, moving slightly as though someone were pushing them, even though no one was there. The eeriness of it made her feel exposed, as if the darkness was still watching her from the shadows, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. As she continued walking, a thought gnawed at her, one that had been growing ever since she had destroyed the doll. The curse had been broken, yes, but what if there was more to it? What if there was another layer, something even darker that she hadn't even touched yet? She felt a chill, a sense of foreboding that crept over her skin like a cold hand brushing her neck. Something in the back of her mind whispered that this town, this entire place, was far more connected to the curse than she had realized. Itilal was far more connected to the curse than she had realized. Wasn't just about the dolls or the souls trapped inside them. It was about the town itself, its history, its forgotten past. The shadows here ran deep, far deeper than she had ever imagined. The light from the street lamps flickered as she walked, the soft glow illuminating the street ahead but leaving the corners of the town in complete darkness. The wind picked up, rustling the leaves in the trees as she made her way to the center of town. There, in the distance, she saw the old town hall, its imposing structure standing like a sentinel in the heart of Windcrest. Eleanor had passed it countless times before, but tonight it seemed different. There was something unsettling, about its towering presence, the way it loomed over the town, as if it had always been there, watching. The building had always seemed so insignificant, but now, after everything that had happened, it felt like it held the key to everything. She found herself walking toward it, drawn herself walking toward it, inexplicably by the pull of something unknown. It was as though the darkness was calling her back, leading her to a place she had never meant to go. The closer she got, the more she could feel it, the energy, like an undercurrent beneath the surface. Something alive, something waiting. She reached the steps of the town hall and stopped, looking up at the massive doors. They were closed, but something about them seemed inviting. The whispers in her mind grew louder, urging her to open the door, to go inside. She hesitated, but her curiosity won out. She had come this far. She couldn't stop now. With a deep breath, she reached for the door handle, feeling the cool metal beneath her fingers. As she turned it, the door creaked open, its heavy hinges protesting the movement. The darkness inside swallowed her whole, and as she stepped into the building, the temperature dropped. The room before her was vast, filled with rows of old wooden pews, their surfaces worn and covered in dust. The faint smell of mildew hung in the air, but there was something else, too. An older scent, a musty odor that made her stomach churn. It was as if the very walls of the building had absorbed the darkness over the years, holding it close, storing it for something. She took a step forward, her heart pounding, the echoes of her footsteps ringing through the empty hall. In the center of the room was a large stone altar, its surface carved with symbols. She didn't recognize the floor around it was cracked, as though the earth beneath the building was breaking apart. Eleanor's eyes scanned the room, and that's when she saw it, a figure, standing in the shadows by the altar, watching her with the altar, cold, unblinking eyes. Her breath caught in her throat as she froze. The figure was tall, shrouded in darkness, its face hidden in the depths of its cloak. She could feel its gaze burning into her, and for a moment she thought she might, as burning into her, and for a moment she thought she might run, but she couldn't move. "You've come back," a voice boomed from the shadows, low and distorted. It was familiar, yet twisted, unlike anything she had heard before. Eleanor's body tensed, her heart racing as the figure took a step forward. The light from the doorway illuminating its form. It was the old man, but twisted and decayed, his features grotesque and warped. His skin was pale and cracked, his eyes hollow pits of darkness. "You cannot escape, Eleanor." His voice echoed through the empty room. "You thought you had defeated the curse, but it has only just begun." The room seemed to grow colder, the air heavier with every word he spoke. The shadows around him stretched and reached out, swirling like a storm, contained within his very presence. "You will never be free." He stepped closer, his movements slow and deliberate. "The curse runs through your veins. Now, you belong to it, just as we all do." Eleanor's breath caught in her throat. She could feel the weight of his words pressing on her, his presence suffocating her. The darkness was alive here, in this place, and it had claimed her once again. And in that moment, Eleanor realized the truth. She had never truly escaped. The curse she had never truly escaped had always been with her, following her, waiting for the right time to strike. But she wasn't going to let it claim her again. With a roar, Eleanor raised her hand, the light from the feather flashing brightly as it filled the room. The shadows recoiled, shrieking in agony as the light surged through the building, illuminating every corner, every dark space. The old man's twisted form staggered back, but his eyes burned with an unnatural fury. "You cannot fight what you are." But Eleanor knew, in that instant, that the fight was hers to win. She had faced the darkness once before, and she would face it again. The light inside her would never fade, not as long as she refused to let the shadows consume her. As the light grew brighter, the old man's form began to disintegrate, the shadows breaking apart in a blaze of fire and light. His scream echoed through the room, a twisted, unholy sound, but it faded as the darkness was torn away. The altars was torn away, cracked, the symbols etched into its surface dissolving in the wake of the light, and as the last of the shadows vanished, Eleanor stood alone in the silent room, the light still pulsing in her hand. For the first time in a long while, Eleanor felt peace. The curse had been defeated, the darkness had been vanquished, and for once, she was free. Eleanor stood in the aftermath, the room now filled with an eerie stillness. The once oppressive presence of the darkness had receded, but there was an unsettling calm that followed in its wake, as though the world was holding its breath, waiting for something more to unfold. The light from the feather was still bright in her hand, its soft pulse reminding her that the battle might have ended, but the war was far from over. She glanced around the room, at the altar that had once been the source of so much pain. The cracks had spread across its surface, but the air no longer felt thick with malice. There were no more whispers, no more voices in her head, only the quiet hum of her own heartbeat. But despite the silence, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was still there, lurking just beneath the surface. She knew the darkness would always return, that it would never be truly gone. It was like a shadow she couldn't outrun, a part of the world that would always find a way back. Eleanor took a deep breath, trying to steady herself, but as she exhaled, a strange pressure built in her chest. She felt a sudden, sharp coldness, like the first gust of winter wind piercing through the warmth of a spring day. It wasn't the same darkness, not the same malevolent force that had haunted her before. No, this was something different, something newer, something watching her. Her heart skipped a beat as she turned toward the doorway, as if she were being drawn by an invisible force. The town hall's grand doors, once cracked open, were now standing fully ajar. The storm outside had calmed, but the air was still thick with an unnatural energy, like the world was waiting for something to shift. The feeling of being watched intensified. Eleanor's grip on the feather tightened as she stepped toward the open doors, her pulse quickening with each step. She had thought that once the darkness was banished, she would be free, but deep down, she knew better. She had only just begun to scratch the surface of the true evil that lay beneath this town. As she reached the threshold, she stopped. A cold gust of wind swept past her, and for a fleeting moment, she thought she saw something. Someone standing at the far end of the hallway. The figure was tall, cloaked in shadow, its features hidden beneath the folds of darkness. It stood motionless, watching her. Eleanor's breath caught. It wasn't the old man. This figure felt different, older, more ancient. Her heart raced, a mixture of fear and defiance swelling in her chest. She had fought the darkness before. She had faced it head-on and survived, but this felt different. This was something deeper, something more primal. Eleanor's voice was steady, though it was a struggle to keep the tremor out of her words. The figure didn't move, but its presence was palpable, suffocating, filling the hallway with a sense of dread. Then, in a voice that sounded like the wind itself, it spoke. "You've come so far, Eleanor." The voice seemed to resonate within her, as though it was inside her mind, not just in the air around her. It made her stomach tighten, her fingers trembling around the feather. But she, trembling around the feather, refused to let fear take hold again. She would not be a victim. "I've defeated you before," she said, her voice gaining strength. I destroyed the curse. I ended it. The figure's laugh was low, cruel, and chilling. The curse was never, the first was never the end, my dear. It took a step forward, and Eleanor could feel the darkness radiating from it. The curse was just a beginning. You thought you could destroy it, but it was always waiting for you. It is always waiting for someone like you. Eleanor's mind raced. What did it mean? Had she been the one to awaken this? Was she chosen for something more sinister than she had realized? What do you want from me? She demanded, stepping forward, the light from the feather growing brighter. I won't give in. You won't control me? The figure tilted its head slightly, as if amused. Control? No, Eleanor. I'm not here to control you. I'm here to remind you. Its voice softened, becoming more intimate, more personal, always call to you. Eleanor's breath hitched. She could feel the weight of its words, the truth buried beneath the layers of fear, the darkness. It had always been a part of her. It had been inside her, waiting until it found its moment to rise. You're wrong, she said, her voice firm despite the doubt creeping in. I'm not a part of this. I won't let it control me. The figure took another step forward, its shadow now stretching long and dark along the hallway floor. Darkness is not something you can fight. It is not something you can erase. You may have defeated it for now, but the seeds have been sown, Eleanor. And when it returns, you will be ready. A cold chill filled the hallway. The figure's form, the was trailed figure and wagon batter, beginning to distort, becoming more nebulous, less defined. The air grew heavy, thick with the sense of inevitability. You cannot stop what has already begun. The shadows around the figure stretched out toward Eleanor, curling like smoke, but she held her ground, the feather glowing brighter than ever, pushing back against the encroaching darkness. I'm not afraid of you, she said through gritted teeth. The figure's laugh faded, replaced by the soft rustling of wind. No, you're not. But you will be. In an instant, the figure was gone. The darkness receded, but the fear it left behind lingered. Eleanor stood alone in the dim hallway, her chest heaving with the adrenaline of the encounter. She knew. Deep nether walls, which originally arranged with the cold fox, for tributary, and the adrenaline of the encounter. Down, that this wasn't the end. The battle, whatever form it would take, was far from over. But this time, she was ready. She had the light and the darkness. No matter how it returned, could not take that away from her. Not again. Eleanor stood in the stillness of the hallway, her breath heavy in her chest. The figure had vanished as quickly as it had appeared, but the weight of its presence remained, pressing down on her like a shadow she couldn't shake. It wasn't over. The curse was not just a battle she had fought and won. It was a cycle, a force she couldn't escape, no matter how much she wanted to quench it. She could feel it in the air, the residue of the encounter. Thick with malevolence, the light from the featherlets flickered weakly in her hand as if sensing the growing darkness once again stirring beneath the surface. The town of Windcrest was quiet, but the silence felt like a warning. Now, the streets seemed emptier, the shadows longer, as though darkness was just biding its time, waiting for her to lower her guard. Eleanor knew she couldn't go back to her old life, the one she had lived before the curse had found her. Everything had changed. She took a step back, her eyes scanning the hallway, looking for any sign of the figure, any movement that might betray the darkness. The whispers, faint but insistent, had returned, just below the threshold of her hearing. They tugged at the edges of her consciousness, reminding her of the part of her she had never fully confronted, the darkness that lived within. The weight of it pressed down on her, and for a moment, she thought she might break. But then the light in her hand flared brighter, pushing back against the shadows. She wasn't the same person she had been when she first found that cursed doll. She had faced the darkness before, and she could do it again. But this time, she knew it would be different. Eleanor turned away from the town hall and walked back toward the street, her steps measured, her gaze sharp. She could feel it. They were watching. The figure had said it was only the beginning. But Eleanor was no longer afraid. She had learned to live with the light inside her, the strength she had summoned from the depths of her own soul. And as she walked, she began to understand something else. The darkness, the curse. It was not something that could be defeated through force. It wasn't about destroying or banishing it. It was about control, understanding, acceptance. It had always been there, within her, waiting for its moment to strike. But now, she could face it on her terms. She wouldn't let it define her. With each step she took, she felt herself growing stronger, more resolute. The curse had found her once, but it wouldn't take her again. Not without a fight, not without her light. The wind picked up, rustling the trees along the street. The leaves shook in the breeze, and for a fleeting moment, Eleanor thought she saw something in the distance, a figure standing in the shadows of an alleyway, watching her. Her pulse quickened, but she didn't hesitate. She knew what she had to do. She crossed the street and walked slowly toward the alley, her eyes narrowing as the figure in the shadows stepped into the dim light. It was human, at least it appeared to be, but there was something off about it, something unsettling in the way it moved, too fluid, too unnatural. As she approached, the figure spoke, its voice a low, calm whisper. "You can't outrun it, Eleanor." Her heart skipped a beat, but she kept walking, her gaze locked on the figure. "Who are you?" she demanded, her voice steady despite the fear creeping at the edges of her mind. The figure smiled, but it was a smile that didn't reach its eyes. "I'm just a messenger. The darkness will find you again." "It always does." Eleanor's grip on. The feather tightened, her resolve hardening. "Not this time. I won't let it control me again." The figure's smile faded, and for a moment, its face seemed to twist, flickering in and out of focus, like a reflection in a cracked mirror. "You're mistaken, Eleanor. You were chosen. You will always be part of this." Without warning, the figure lunged toward her, its hands outstretched. Eleanor didn't flinch. Instead, she stepped forward, her other hand raised high, the light from the feather flaring in a brilliant burst. The figure recoiled, its scream echoing in the night as the light washed over it, dissolving the shadows that clung to its form. But as it vanished, the voice remained, a haunting whisper that seemed to fill the air around her. "You cannot escape your fate." Eleanor stood alone in the street, the whispers fading into silence once again. The town felt quieter now, as though it had finally exhaled, released from the grip of the curse. For a moment, it seemed as though the battle was truly over, the darkness banished for good. But deep inside her, Eleanor knew better. She couldn't outrun it. She couldn't escape the truth. The darkness was not something she could destroy. It was part of her, as much a part of her as the light she carried. The war wasn't over. It would never be over, but she would keep fighting. She would keep fighting. She would keep walking, no matter how many times the darkness tried to take her, because, long as the light remained within her, there was still hope. And with that hope, she could face anything that came next. Eleanor walked through the empty streets of Windcrest, her footsteps echoing against the cold pavement. The town felt pavement, almost alive, breathing quietly under the weight of her thoughts. The air was thick, but not with the same stifling pressure of the curse. No, this time it was different. It was the calm before another storm, and she knew, deep down, that the darkness wasn't gone. It had simply retreated, waiting for the right moment to strike again. She glanced back at the empty town hall. The place had once felt like the epicenter of the curse, but now it seemed like a distant memory, a nightmare fading in the light of her victory, or so she thought. Her hand instinctively reached into her pocket, her fingers brushing against the familiar, reassuring weight of the feather. The light it emitted, the midst of the chaos, but as she clutched it, a nagging thought tugged at her consciousness. What if the light isn't enough next time? She didn't have an answer. She couldn't afford to have doubt, not now. Eleanor's thoughts were interrupted by the sudden gust of wind, sharp and cold. The branches of the trees lining the street swayed, their limbs creaking under the weight of a void. The storm brewing in the distance. She looked up, her gaze following the darkening sky. The wind picked up again, this time howling through the streets, rattling the windows of the houses around her. Suddenly, she felt it. A pulse, deep within, her chest, like a heartbeat. But it wasn't her own. It was something else. Something dark. The light from the feather flickered in her hand as the shadows around her deepened, stretching longer than they should, and the air thickened, pressing in on her once again. It was happening. The curse hadn't just been a series of events or a twisted set of coincidences. It was something older, something that had always been a part of this town, its very foundation. She had felt it before, but now it was undeniable. The darkness was tied to Windcrest, tied to the very land beneath her feet, and that meant, no matter what she did, no matter how many battles she fought, the town would never be truly free. Eleanor's heart quickened, and she turned toward the sound of footsteps slowly. They grew louder, deliberate, and slow. She couldn't see who it was, but she could feel them approaching. Her fingers tightened around the feather, and she steeled herself for what was to come. She couldn't afford to hesitate. Not now. A shadow emerged from the corner of the street, moving toward her. The figure was tall, its features cloaked in darkness. The same foreboding energy she had felt earlier pulsed from the figure, like an extension of the shadows around her. Eleanor stood firm, refusing to be intimidated. "You thought you could walk away," the figure said, its voice deep and hollow, like the wind howling through an empty cavern. "But you can't run from what's inside you." Eleanor's pulse raced. She had seen this before. This figure, this presence. It was like the one she had faced in the town hall, only more tangible now, more real. It had followed her. She wasn't sure how, but she knew it was tied to the curse, tied to the town. "Who are you?" she demanded, her voice steady despite the fear gnawing at her. The figure stepped closer, its face still hidden in shadow, but its form now illuminated by the faint light of the feather. "I am the keeper of what you've unleashed, Eleanor. Am what you will never escape." Eleanor felt a coldness creep through her veins. The keeper. She couldn't understand what it meant, but it didn't matter. The fear she had once felt was no longer something she allowed to control her. "What do you want?" she asked, keeping her voice firm. The figure's laugh was soft, almost pitying. "You think you can destroy us? You think your light will save you? But we are eternal. You've only unlocked a small part of what this place holds. Windcrest is not just a town, it is the source of the curse." Eleanor stepped back. "What are you talking about?" The figure extended its hand, and Eleanor's breath caught. The shadows around her swirled, and for a brief moment, she saw what was behind them. Images flickering like a film reel. It was Windcrest, but not as she knew it. The town was older, twisted, full of strange symbols and people she didn't recognize. This town was built on the darkness, Eleanor, the figure continued, on sacrifice. And you have awakened the old power. The curse was never something that could be broken. It is the very foundation of this place. You too are part of it. Eleanor's eyes widened. No, I'm not part of this. I destroyed the curse. I broke it. The figure's grin twisted beneath its shadowed hood. You only freed the souls. You never understood what it was. You never understood what you became when you broke the chains. The ground beneath Eleanor's feet trembled. She stumbled. Her sounded ears. And Rory's trembled. No, very Eleanor's feet trembled. She stumbled, her heart racing as she felt the weight of the curse pushing back, threatening to overwhelm her. The whispers were back, louder now, mingling with the figure's voice. Join us, Eleanor. You belong to this place. You belong to us. Eleanor gritted her teeth, clenching the feathers so tightly that her knuckles turned white. The light pulsed brighter, and she shouted, No, I won't be part of this. I am stronger than this darkness. The figure's laugh was the last sound she heard before the world around her seemed to warp and twist. The light from the feather expanded outward, flooding the street with a blinding brilliance. The darkness back once more, but as the light receded, she realized with a sinking heart that the figure was still standing, unaffected by her light, its form solidifying once more, its grin widening. You cannot fight what you are, it said, its voice dripping with finality. You are part of this curse now, Eleanor. You always will be. Eleanor felt the ground shift beneath her feet, and the whispers of the lost souls grew louder. There was no escape. The darkness had always been. The darkness had always been. Inside her, it wasn't just a curse to fight. It was a battle she would never truly win. The only question now was, would she ever accept it? Eleanor's heart pounded in her chest, the weight of the figure's words settling heavily on her. The light from the feather flickered, as if it too were struggling against the darkness that had once again wrapped itself around her. She wanted wrapped itself around her, to fight. She had fought before, and she would again. But as the figure's form solidified, her pulse quickened, and a growing realization gnawed at the edges of her mind. This wasn't something she could defeat with light, alone. The curse wasn't something that could be broken. It wasn't something that could be banished. It was part of the land, part of her, and there was no escaping that. Her hand tightened around the feather, and for a brief moment she felt a flicker of the power she had drawn on before. Something strong, something ancient that ran deeper than the fear that clutched at her heart. It was her light, born from within her, not from any object or tool. She looked at the figure before her, her mind racing. She had already defeated so much. The curse, the dolls, the souls. But now it was clear. This was no ordinary enemy. This was no monster or shadow. She could banish. This was the true heart of the curse. This was the keeper, the one who had been behind it all. I am not like you, Eleanor said, her voice trembling, but determined. You don't understand. I have the strength to fight this. I am not part of you. The figure's grin twisted. Oh, Eleanor, you were always part of you. You can fight it, but you will always be drawn to the darkness. It is in your blood. With that, the figure took a step forward, and the shadows followed, swirling around Eleanor's feet, rising like an ocean tide. Her breath caught in her throat as she felt the cold, suffocating energy of the curse seep into her bones. The whispers grew louder, filling her mind with the voices of those who had come before her, the souls, the lost, the children. Her legs wobbled as she, children, struggled to stand. the darkness pulling her down, but something within her snapped. She had survived before. She could survive again. She wouldn't let this consume her. Focusing all her energy on the light inside her, she let go of her fear, her doubt. The whispers that had once controlled her thoughts were now just noise. She shut them out, allowing only the light to remain. She raised the feather high, the pulse of its power surging through her, radiating outward like a beam of pure light. You are wrong. Her voice was low but fierce. I am not part of this curse. I refuse to let you control me. The figure stepped back, its expression shifting for the first time. A flicker of uncertainty passing through its certain, otherwise solid form. The light from the feather intensified, pushing the shadows away, forcing them to retreat into the corners. The darkness screamed, but Eleanor's will was stronger. This time, she would not yield with every breath. She would not yield with every breath. She could feel the energy rising within her, amplifying the light, until it exploded outward in a wave of brilliance. The shadows fought back, the air heavy with their malevolent force, but they were no match for her now. The light, fueled by her defiance, cut through the darkness, each pulse sending waves of energy crashing into the figure, weakening its hold on the world. The figure screeched, its form flickering, its cloak dissolving into the air like smoke. For a moment, Eleanor, like smoke, thought she had won. The figure was fading. The darkness was retreating, and the light was victorious. But as the figure vanished into the air, its last words echoed in her mind like a final curse. You cannot escape what is already inside you. Her body trembled with the effort, her strength waning, but she held firm. The battle wasn't over, not by a long shot. She had defeated the figure, but something told her that this wasn't the last of the curse. The land, the town, the very air she breathed was still marked by the darkness. But for the first time, Eleanor understood. The darkness was not an enemy she could defeat. It was something she would have to live with. Something she would have to live with. Something she would have to face every day. She wasn't afraid anymore. The light within her was her strength, and as long as she carried it, she could face whatever the curse threw her way. As the last of the shadows receded, Eleanor turned away, the light from the feather still shining brightly in her hand. She had won this battle, but she knew the war was far from over. The darkness would return, but so would she, and next time she would be ready. Eleanor walked slowly down the quiet street, the weight of the night pressing on her shoulders, yet the light within her was unwavering, bright in her chest. She had driven the darkness back, for now, but the figure's final words echoed in her mind like a persistent whisper, one that refused to fade. You cannot escape what is already inside you. It was a truth she didn't want to face. She had always thought the curse was an external force, something she could battle and defeat. But the figure had made it clear. The darkness was inside her. It had always been. It had chosen her. The realization sent a cold shiver down her spine. Her breath quickened. The shadows around her seemed to shift, swirling with an energy that felt both familiar and unsettling. She paused in her tracks, looking her tracks. Around, the streets of Windcrest were still, too still, but her senses felt heightened, as though the town itself was holding its breath. The feeling of being watched returned, stronger than before. Her hand instinctively went to the feather in her pocket, the cool metal a reminder of the power that had kept the darkness at bay. But as she gripped it, she could feel the faintest tremor, the whisper of something stirring deep inside her. The feather, the light, had been her ally, but was it enough to keep the curse from consuming her? Would she be strong enough to face whatever was coming? Her mind flashed back to the town hall, to the figure's words. You are part of it. You will always be part of it. Eleanor clenched her fist around the feather, trying to ignore the growing anxiety that gnawed at her. She had to keep moving. She had to keep fighting. The curse might have been inside her, but she wasn't going to let it control her. Not again. But as she reached the end of the street, her thoughts were interrupted by a sound, a low, faint hum that seemed to come from nowhere and everywhere at once. The hairs on the back of her neck stood on end as the hum grew louder, more insistent, and suddenly she could feel it, a wave of cold air sweeping over her, thick with a familiar, suffocating darkness. She spun around, heart racing, but there was nothing. The street was empty. No one was there. Yet the hum persisted, vibrating through her chest, seeping into her chest, seeping into her bones without warning. The air around her seemed to shift. The wind picked up again, but this time it was colder, sharp, biting. The leaves on the trees shook violently, and the ground beneath her feet trembled, as if something deep within the earth was stirring. Eleanor, the whisper came again, but this time it wasn't just in her mind. It was in the air, coming from all directions, surrounding her. Her breath caught in her throat as she spun, looking for the source of the voice, but it was no use. It was everywhere. The shadows on the ground began to stretch, elongating like dark fingers reaching out for her. She stepped back, instinctively, but they followed, curling around her ankles, holding her in place. The hum grew louder, reverberating in her chest as the darkness closed in. You cannot escape. Eleanor's pulse raced, the pressure of the curse tightening around her chest. Her vision blurred, and she felt the familiar sensation of being pulled, a gravitational force trying to draw her into the shadows. Her hand trembled as she raised the feather, the light glowing faintly in her palm. She focused on it, drawing strength from the light, but the shadows around her twisted, feeding off her fear. Growing stronger with every breath she took, the ground beneath her cracked, the town itself seeming to split open as the darkness surged upward. A wave of malice that engulfed her, threatening to swallow her whole. No, she gritted her teeth, her voice barely a whisper, but her resolve was unwavering. I will not let you win. With every ounce of her strength, she pushed against the pull of the shadows, the light from the feather growing brighter, the glow searing through the darkness around her. The hum turned into a scream, a high-pitched into a scream, a high-pitched wail of frustration, but it was too late. The darkness recoiled, shrinking back from the force of the light. The figure's words echoed in her mind once more, but Eleanor knew, with absolute certainty, that she could fight it. She could fight it. She could fight it. Resist. She raised the feather higher, feeling the warmth surge through her, flooding every inch of her body, igniting the very core of her being. The shadows retreated further, disintegrating under the pressure of her light. You cannot control me, she shouted, the words bursting from her chest with power she didn't know she had. Not again! I am in control! The light erupted in a final, brilliant explosion, washing over the street, scattering the darkness into nothingness. The shadows screamed, their form breaking apart, and for a moment, everything went quiet. The wind stopped, the hum stopped, disappeared, and the oppressive feeling that had been suffocating her vanished. Eleanor stood alone in the empty street, gasping for air, her body trembling with the effort. But the town felt there, deep inside her, but for now, it had been pushed back. The feather's glow dimmed, and her hand fell to her side. She wasn't sure how long the peace would last, but for the first time, she knew she could stand up to whatever came next. She had been wrong to think she could escape the curse, but she didn't have to escape. She just had to live with it and fight it. Each and every time it tried to consume her, the battle wasn't over. It never would be. But Eleanor was no longer afraid. Eleanor stood alone, the remnants of the darkness fading into the cool night air. Her heart was still racing, the adrenaline from the battle pumping through her veins. But despite the temporary victory, she couldn't shake the feeling that something more insidious was at play. The light she wielded, powerful as it was, couldn't erase the truth she had come to understand. The curse wasn't something that could be defeated. It was something that would always return. Something that would always return. Something she would always have to fight. The streets of Windcrest seemed eerily silent now. The usual hum of the town stilled. It was as if the world itself was waiting for her next move. But Eleanor knew better than to think the darkness had truly gone. She had only delayed it. As she walked down the street, the weight of her thoughts pressing on her chest, a strange sensation lingered, a tugging at the edges of her mind. She could feel it again, the hum, but this time it was different. It was different. Wasn't the distant, faint whisper she had heard before. This felt closer, realer. Her pulse quickened. Her breath caught in her throat. She looked. There was no one. The street was empty. Still. Eleanor, the voice again. This time softer, more insistent. A whisper that seemed to curl around her thoughts. She couldn't tell if it was coming from the air, from the town, or from inside her own head. But it was there, unmistakable, pulling her in. The shadows stretched in the corners of the street, twisting as if alive, and for the first time in a long while, Eleanor felt the weight of them, felt how close they them were. She took a step forward, her feet moving on their own, guided by the unseen force that was drawing her deeper into the town. "Who's there?" she demanded, her voice shaking but strong. "Show yourself." The wind picked up, cold and sharp, biting at her skin. She felt a cold touch against her neck, like fingers grazing her skin, and spun around once again, but again. Nothing. The street was still, the shadows longer now as the streetlights flickered above her. And then she saw it. In the distance, at the edge of the street, a figure was standing in the shadows, watching her. It was a person, but not quite. Silhouette was too tall, too twisted. Its form seemed to bend unnaturally, the darkness pooling around it like a cloak. Eleanor could feel its eyes on her, cold and unblinking, though she couldn't make out the details of its face. "Eleanor, you've come back." The voice was clearer now, sharper, resonating in her mind like a drumbeat. It was the same voice from before, the one that had echoed through the halls of the town hall, the one that had warned her she would never escape. It was the keeper, the one who had told her the darkness would always return. Eleanor's heart raced, and her hand tightened around the feather. She wasn't going to let it take her again. She had fought before, and she would do so and she would do so again. But this time, something was different. The darkness felt heavier, thicker, like it was filling the streets, pulling at her. "You can't escape what's inside you, Eleanor." The figure's voice was a low growl, a whisper that wrapped around her bones. "The curse is within you. You are the curse now." Eleanor's chest tightened. The figure's words felt like an echo of her own thoughts, the ones she had buried deep inside her, the truth she had tried to ignore. "The darkness is inside me." "No," Eleanor whispered, shaking her head. "No, I won't let it control me." The figure stepped forward, its form becoming clearer with every step, its silhouette stretching and distorting with unnatural ease. The air grew colder, and Eleanor's breath came out in visible puffs, like smoke in the frigid night. "You have no choice, Eleanor." The figure's voice grew louder, reverberating through the town, its power pushing against her. "The darkness will always find you. It has always been here, waiting for someone to unlock it. And you did now. You must carry it." Eleanor stumbled backward, the weight of the figure's words sinking in like a dagger to her heart. The curse had never been just about the dolls or the souls. It was always about her. She had been chosen. The moment she had touched that cursed doll, she had unlocked something far worse than she could ever imagine. The shadows in the street began to stretch again, their dark tendrils reaching out toward her. She could feel them pulling at her, trying to drag her back into their grasp. And for a moment, it felt as if her will was slipping, as if the darkness was finally going to claim her. But then she remembered the light, the strength that she had called upon before. She wasn't the same person who had walked into the town hall, frightened and unsure. She was stronger now. She had faced the darkness and survived. She had the power within her. With sharp breath, Eleanor raised the feather high above her head, the light flaring once again, brighter than ever before. She could feel it. Her light, her will, filling her, pushing back the shadows. The darkness writhed and hissed, unable to withstand the force of her light. The figure recoiled, its form flickering, its voice a faint growl in the wind. "You think you've won?" The figure sneered, its voice fading as the light grew brighter, pushing the figure back into the shadows. "This is far from over." But Eleanor stood firm, the light from the feather now so powerful it illuminated the entire street. The shadows shrank away, retreating into the night. The figure's voice faded, replaced by the sound of wind through the trees and the faint hum of peace settling over the town. The battle wasn't over. She knew it never would be, but for now, the darkness had been pushed back, and as long as Eleanor carried the light within her, she would keep fighting. Eleanor stood still in the middle of the quiet street, the glow of the feather now dimming slightly in her hand, the warmth of its light in her hand, the warmth of its light slowly fading. The echoes of the figure's words still lingered in her mind, their weight heavy like chains she couldn't shake off. She knew what she had done, pushed back the darkness for now, but in her heart there was no real sense of her victory. It was only temporary. The whispers had stopped, but their presence, their promise, still clung to her thoughts. The darkness wasn't something that could be defeated. It was inside her, a part of her, and no matter how much light she brought to bear, it would always be waiting for her to lower her guard. She sighed deeply and looked around. The streets of Windcrest, once filled with life and familiarity, now felt foreign to her. The quietness was unsettling, like Theatness was unsettling, calm before another storm. She couldn't shake the feeling that she wasn't alone, even though the street was empty. The shadows seemed to grow darker, stretching unnaturally long in the corners of her vision, pulling at her, as if beckoning her back into their fold. She had to keep moving. She had to leave the house, the town. She couldn't stay here, not with this feeling of constant dread, not with the curse still lurking inside her. She turned around, preparing to leave the street and head for the woods where she could think. But before she could take another step, something caught her eye. A figure. It was standing at the end of the street, almost hidden by the shadows, just out of sight. The figure was tall, cloaked, with a presence that seemed to command the darkness around it. Her heart skipped a beat. It was not the same figure she had faced before. No, this one felt older, more ancient, and much more powerful. It was not human, but something deeper, something born of the curse itself. The figure's eyes glowed faintly, two piercing orbs of light that shone through the darkness like a lighthouse through the fog. And then it spoke. The words slow, deliberate, as if testing the weight of each syllable. Eleanor. Her breath caught in her throat. She had heard that voice before, but it had never sounded like this. It wasn't the same whispering voice she had heard in the town hall, or the one that had threatened her and threatened her in the side streets. This voice was more. It was older, wiser. It was the voice of something that had seen centuries pass by, something that knew more about her than she could possibly understand. You've done well to push back the darkness, but you are not the one who can end it. Eleanor felt her body tense as she stood frozen in place, her pulse racing. The figure's gaze didn't leave her, but she couldn't move, couldn't speak. Every instinct screamed for her to run, to flee, but she knew she had to face this. She had no choice. The figure stepped forward slowly, its form towering over her, its cloak billowing, as if it had a life of its own. As it came closer, the shadows seemed to bend around it, curling in reverence, as if the figure were the very source of the darkness itself. You have awakened it, Eleanor, and now you will learn that the curse has never been just about dolls, or souls, or vessels. It has always been about you. Her mind raced, her thoughts whirlwind as she tried to process what the figure was saying. About me? She whispered under her breath. The figure's eyes glowed brighter now, and a twisted smile spread across its shadowed face. Yes, the curse chose you long ago. You were always its true heir. Eleanor stepped back, shaking her head. No, I'm really... I'm not a part of this. I broke it. I ended it. The figure's smile deepened, a dark amusement gleaming in its eyes. You think you ended it? How naive. You never understood the nature of the curse. The curse cannot be destroyed. It can only be transferred. The figure leaned closer, its presence suffocating her as it spoke the next words in a whisper that chilled her to the core. And now it is inside of you. Eleanor stumbled back, the air growing colder around her. She could feel the weight of the figure's words pressing on her chest, suffocating her. The darkness was no longer just around her. It was inside her, woven into her very soul. She had broken the curse, but it had been transferred to her. The curse was hers to bear. The figure's laugh echoed through the empty street, sending a shiver down Eleanor's spine. The light you summoned was a mere distraction, Eleanor. The darkness that runs through your blood is more powerful than you can imagine. You will learn to embrace it. Eventually, Eleanor felt the warmth of the feather in her hand dim, the light flickering in her palm like a dying flame. The figure stepped back, its form fading into the shadows, but its words lingered in the air. It will find you again, and this time, you will have no choice but to accept it. The figure was gone before she could react, disappearing into the darkness. Eleanor stood alone in the street, her body shaking as the weight of the figure's words settled deep within her. The curse wasn't gone. It wasn't broken. It was inside her, feeding off her fear, waiting to come back stronger, darker than before. The whispers began again, faint at first but growing louder in her mind. They were no longer distant. They were inside her thoughts, twisting, curling around her consciousness like tendrils of smoke. She could feel it. The curse, the darkness, and for the first time, Eleanor realized she had only begun to fight. Eleanor stood frozen, her body shaking as the weight of the curse pressed down on her like 1,000 unseen hands. The street, once calm, felt heavy with the oppressive presence of the darkness now living inside her. The figure's final words echoed in her mind, repeating over and over like a chant she couldn't escape. The curse will find you again, and this time you will find you again, and have no choice but to accept it. She closed her eyes, forcing herself to breathe. The light from the feather was dimming, flickering weakly in her hand. She had fought so hard to push back the darkness, to free herself from the curse. But now she understood the truth. The curse was never something external to her. It had always been inside her, waiting to awaken. Her hand tightened around the feather, her knuckles white as the weight of the figure's words sank deeper. The whispers white as the weight of the figure's words sank deeper. In her mind swirled, growing louder, urging her to give in, to accept her fate. You are the curse. You are the curse. Around her, once familiar and safe, now seemed to pulse with a dark energy, as if the curse had seeped into the very fabric of Windcrest itself. She could feel it in the air, in the ground beneath her feet. The town was changing, twisting, becoming something it had never been before. She turned, her feet carrying her without thought, walking deeper into the streets of Windcrest. Every step felt heavier, as if the darkness was pulling her down, but she refused to stop. She refused to stop. She couldn't let it win. Not again. The whispers intensified, growing frantic, desperate. It's not over. You will be consumed. There is no escape. They clawed at her mind, drowning her in doubt. She reached the edge of town, where the trees grew thick and dark, their branches gnarled and twisted. The air here was colder, charged with a palpable sense of something waiting. The darkness felt stronger here, more alive, like it was beckoning her, inviting her to join it. She stopped at the edge of the forest, the whispers now an overwhelming chorus in her mind. She could see the shadows shifting in the trees, moving like living things, creeping closer. Her heart raced. Her breath quickened. The light in her hand flickered one last time before fading completely into darkness. For a moment, she felt completely alone. Her only company, the cold and the darkness. The weight of the curse was suffocating. She wanted to scream, to break free, but she could barely breathe. Every thought in her mind was overwhelmed by the whispers, by the curse. Then, suddenly, a voice broke through the chaos in her mind. You are not alone. Eleanor's heart skipped a beat as the voice spoke, soft, familiar. It was a voice she had heard only in the quiet moments of her mind, a voice that brought warmth in the midst of the cold. The boy. She turned quickly, scanning the forest around her. There was no one. The shadows clung to the trees, their forms barely visible in the dim light. But there was something different about them now. They weren't just threatening. They were waiting. You've always been here, Eleanor. The voice again, closer this time. She spun, but still saw no one. You are not alone. The curse, it is part of you, but you can still fight it. The boy's voice was softer now, almost comforting, but Eleanor was unsure. Could she trust it? Was it real, or just another trick of the darkness? Her hand reached out instinctively, but the shadows around her seemed to shrink back, as if something was holding them at bay. For a brief moment, she felt a flicker of hope. Then, the shadows lunged, and the ground beneath her feet trembled. The whispering voices grew louder, more frantic, their words becoming indistinct but full of fear. The darkness surged forward with a force she had never felt before, pulling at her, trying to drag her into its depths. But before the shadows, he said sexy, distorts to kindergetsi, and entirety, lest the Gregory, that's just all worry, could consume her. A light, weak but real, flickered from the direction of the voice. Eleanor turned toward it, instinctively moving closer, her steps hesitant but determined. She could feel it now, the faint pulse of something warm in the cold, of something warm in the cold. Darkness, it was the light. her light, and for the first time in what felt like forever, she felt a flicker of peace, of control. The boy's voice grew louder, clearer, now not in her mind, but around her, guiding her through the dark, leading her toward the light. You've always had it in you, Eleanor. The curse doesn't control you. You control it. Her heart hammered in her chest as she focused on the light. The darkness recoiled, thrashing around her, but it couldn't hold its ground. The light surged again, brighter this time, pushing the shadows away, forcing them back into the depths of the forest. You are not the curse. You are the light. The light flared again, this time completely engulfing her. The darkness screamed, its form unraveling and retreating into the woods. The boy's voice grew distant, but the warmth remained, like a quiet heartbeat inside her. And then, with a final burst, the darkness was gone. For a moment, there was only the sound of the wind in the trees and the soft rustling of the leaves. Eleanor stood in the center of the forest, the faint glow of the light still pulsing gently in her hand, her chest heaving with the effort. The battle was far from over. She knew that the curse was not something that could be vanquished in a single fight. It was a part of her, and always would be. But for now, she had won. She had won. She had faced the darkness, and she had pushed it back. She wasn't afraid anymore. As long as the light remained inside her, she would keep fighting. Eleanor stood in the center of the forest, her breath coming in sharp, uneven gasps. But there was no sense of victory in her chest, just a deep, aching exhaustion. The light in her hand flickered gently, a beacon in the now quiet woods, but it felt fragile, as if the very act of fighting the darkness had drained everything from her. The forest around her was still, but it was the kind of stillness that was still, it was the kind of stillness that made the hairs on her neck stand up, a silence that felt like the calm before another storm. The darkness had retreated for now, but she knew this wasn't over. The curse was inside her, woven into her soul, and it wasn't something that could be cast out or destroyed. It wasn't just some force to be fought. It was a part of her. Her thoughts raced as she tried to piece together what she had learned, but the pieces seemed to keep slipping through her fingers. She had thought the curse slipped us, not his fingers. Wars could be destroyed. She had thought it was something outside of her, something that could be fought and beaten. But the moment the figure had told her she was the curse, part of it, it all clicked into place. She hadn't broken the curse. She hadn't broken the curse. Become it. The weight of the realization pressed down on her chest, suffocating her. The whispers were back, soft at first, but then growing louder. Voices was maddening, like thousands of thoughts colliding inside her head, drowning out her ability to think. She closed her eyes and gripped the feather tightly, trying to hold on to the light, to the warmth that had kept her going through the darkest moments. But even the light seemed fragile now. It flickered, and for a moment, she wondered if it, too, was slipping from her grasp. No, she thought, shaking her head, trying to clear her mind. I won't let this consume me. The light surged again, stronger this time, a radiant pulse that pushed against the darkness in her chest. The whispers faltered for just a second, and Eleanor seized the opportunity, raising the feather high above her head. She focused on feather high above her head, light within her, the strength she had found, the hope that had kept her fighting even when she thought she might break. I control this. I am the light, she whispered to herself, the words like a mantra, grounding her, reminding her of the strength she carried inside. The feather flared again, brighter than ever, and this time the darkness recoiled. The whispers faded into silence. The weight on her chest lifted, and the chill in the air receded, leaving behind only the soft hum of the forest around her. But Eleanor knew she couldn't let her guard down. The curse hadn't been broken. It hadn't even been defeated. She couldn't simply erase it. It was her now. And as long as she carried it, there would always be that pull, those whispers, that dark presence waiting for the right moment to rise again. She took a deep breath, steadying herself. The light inside her was still there. It had not faded, and as long as it remained, she would keep fighting. But she also knew that the battle was no longer just with the shadows. It was with herself. The curse was her, and the only way to truly fight it was to accept it, to live with it, to control it. Eleanor turned toward the edge of the forest. The path back to Windcrest barely visible in the dim light. She didn't know what awaited her there, what the curse might try next, or how much longer she could keep it at bay. But one thing was clear, she couldn't stay here, alone, with the darkness closing in. She had to return. She had to face whatever came next. As she walked, the light in her hand pulsed softly, a reminder of her resolve. She wasn't free, but she wasn't trapped either. Not anymore. The fight wasn't over, but she wasn't trapped either. Not anymore. Would keep fighting because she had learned that she could, and as long as there was light inside her, she wouldn't give up. Eleanor walked steadily through the forest, her feet crunching softly on the frost-covered ground. The path ahead seemed endless, but each step was purposeful, driven by the need to understand, to confront what she had become. The light in her hand still glowed faintly, a comforting presence that reminded her of her strength, but it was only a small light in the vast darkness that surrounded her. Her thoughts were a storm, tumbling over each other in confusion and fear. She had been so sure, so certain that the curse could be eradicated. But now she understood. The darkness inside her wasn't something that could be destroyed. It was something that had always been there, and the moment she had touched the doll, it had taken root in her very soul. The wind whistled through the trees, sending shivers down her spine. She pulled her straw and their sistwise coat tighter around her body, but the chill was more than just physical. It was deep inside her, curling in her chest. She could feel it, the pull of the curse, a constant reminder that she wasn't in control, that no matter how much light she summoned, the darkness would always find its way back. It wasn't just about surviving anymore. It wasn't even about fighting it. She had to live with it. She had to find a way to coexist with the curse, to keep it from consuming her. But how? Her mind kept drifting back to the figure in the street, the one who had whispered the truth to her. You are part of it. The curse had been waiting for her, ready to claim her as its own. The figure had spoken of this as if it were inevitable, and perhaps, in some ways, it was. She had been chosen, but she would not be defined by that choice. The sound of approaching footsteps broke her from her thoughts. Her heart leaped in her chest, the sudden fear rushing in like a tide. Looked up, squinting into the distance, but saw no one. The forest was still. A cold gust of wind swept through the trees, and Eleanor felt a strange presence in the air. The whispers came again, but this time they weren't in her mind. They whispers came again, but this time they weren't in her mind. Were in the air, like faint voices carried on the wind, their words barely audible, but unmistakable. You can't escape us, Eleanor. She stopped in her tracks, her blood running cold. The whispering voices were all around her now, like a chorus of unseen figures, speaking in unison. The wind picked up, the voices growing louder, until they were overwhelming. The shadows around her seemed to grow darker, swirling in response to the whispers, closing in on her. The forest, once quiet, was now alive with the sound of the curse, like a storm on the horizon waiting to strike. You will be ours. Eleanor's breath caught in her throat. The curse wasn't just around her. It was inside the very fabric of the world, around her, in the air she breathed, in the trees that lined the path. It had always been there, waiting for the right moment to return. She raised the feather, the light pulsing weakly in her hand. But the darkness seemed to swallow it in her hand. But the darkness seemed to swallow it whole, dimming the glow until it was barely a flicker. The whispers grew louder, more insistent, pushing against her, filling her mind with fear and doubt. She closed her eyes, trying to block them out, but they were everywhere. You can't fight us. You are ours. Eleanor felt her strength waning, her body trembling as the darkness pressed in on her from all sides. She was losing control. The curse was taking over. And she couldn't stop it. She wasn't strong enough. Eleanor? The voice was closer now, almost tangible, echoing through the trees. She opened her eyes, and standing before her, in the clearing ahead, was a figure, a shadow, indistinct at first. But then it took form, solidifying into the shape of a man. His face was hidden in shadow, but his presence was overwhelming. He was tall, gaunt, with eyes that glowed faintly in the darkness. You were always meant for this, he said, his voice low and filled with authority. The darkness never left you. It's always been inside you, waiting for the right moment. And now, it's time to embrace it. Eleanor's chest tightened as the weight of his words crashed down on her. She had been prepared for this. She had known it would come to this. The curse, the darkness. It wasn't something she could outrun, but she could fight it with every ounce of strength she had left. Eleanor lifted the feather higher, the light from it growing brighter, struggling against the shadows that closed in around her. It flickered, but the light was still there. It wasn't over. The figure stepped forward, his shadow stretching like tendrils to wrap around her. But Eleanor pushed against it. The light surged, breaking through the darkness for just a moment. But the figure didn't falter. He smiled, a twisted, knowing smile. You can't win this fight, Eleanor. His voice was full of quiet satisfaction. The curse is already yours. You're part of it, and it will always come back, no matter how hard you try to fight it. She stepped forward, her feet moving on their own, each step feeling heavier than the last. She felt the weight of the darkness pulling at her, but she kept going. She had to fight. She had to find a way to control this. You will never control it. The figure's voice was cold, but Eleanor didn't stop. The light surged again, and with it came a surge of clarity. She understood now. The darkness wasn't something she had to fight against. It was something she had to embrace, something she had to control. She was the one who had to master it, or it would master her. The whispering voices faded as she focused, the light from the feather growing brighter with each thought. The darkness faltered, recoiling from her newfound strength, but the figure only smiled, the shadows around him swirling, twisting like a living thing. You are the light and the darkness, Eleanor. It is your destiny to walk the line between them. The realization hit her hard. The curse was her destiny, but it didn't define her. She could control it. The battle wasn't over. It had only just begun. Eleanor stood still, her breath ragged as the figure in his soul. And Baron as a figure in right front of her continued to watch with those piercing eyes. The shadows around him writhed, crawling like serpents on the ground. But she could feel something shifting within her, a quiet strength rising from the depths of her being. The darkness had always been inside her, but now she understood it wasn't something that would consume her. It was a part of her, just as much as the light. She raised the feather once more, its glow pulsing with new life, brighter and steadier this time. The figure before her did not flinch. He only watched, his smile widening, but there was no fear in his eyes. There was something almost knowing about his expression. "You don't understand, do you?" The figure's voice was like the low rumble of distant thunder, his words dripping with contempt. "You think you can control this, but you can't. You are the darkness. It will always be part of you, and one day it will consume you." The words stung, but they no longer felt like a threat. They felt like a challenge, and Eleanor wasn't about to back down. "I know what I am," she said, her voice strong, clear, despite the weight of the curse that still hung over her. "And I know what you are," the figure's smile faltered, his eyes narrowing. Eleanor stepped forward, her heart steady and her steps measured, each one feeling firmer than the last. The shadows parted before her, shrinking away from the light, but not entirely. They lingered, circling her, testing her resolve. "You're right," she continued, her voice soft but unwavering. "The darkness is a part of me, but it doesn't define me. It doesn't control me. I control it. For a moment, their way control it." Was silence. The figure stood motionless, and Eleanor could feel the weight of his gaze, the presence of something ancient pressing in on her, but she refused to look away. She had learned something tonight, something vital. The darkness wasn't just an external enemy. It was an integral part of her, something that had always been there. It wasn't something to destroy. It was something to understand, to master. The figure seemed to consider her words, his expression unreadable. Then, with a slow, deliberate movement, he stepped back, his form dissolving into the shadows like smoke, leaving behind only the echo of his voice. "You will be tested, Eleanor. You will fall, and when you do, there will be none one to save you." The voice lingered in the air, heavy and final, but Eleanor stood firm, her resolve stronger than ever. She had faced the darkness before. She would face it again, and this time she would not be afraid. She would not be afraid. She would not let it claim her. As the figure's presence faded, the shadows began to recede, but Eleanor knew better than to think it was truly over. The curse was still inside her, swirling, waiting for its chance to rise again. But she also knew now that she chance to rise again wasn't powerless. She could choose how to wield it. She could choose to walk with the darkness, to keep it in check, to use it when necessary, but never let it define her. The wind shifted, the trees around her whispering with a sound she couldn't quite decipher. But the air felt lighter now, no longer heavy with the weight of her fear. The curse had not been vanquished, but she had taken the first step toward understanding it, toward owning it. Eleanor exhaled. The tension in her. Eleanor exhaled. The tension in it. Her chest finally releasing, she turned away from the path she had been on, knowing that her journey was far from over. The town of Windcrest loomed in the distance, dark and silent, but there was no fear in her heart. The darkness might always be there, lurking in the corners of her soul, but as long as she held on to the light within, she would always have the strength to fight. She took a deep breath, feeling the light within her pulse with energy, with purpose. The shadows would return. Of that she was certain, but she would face them on her own terms. She wasn't running anymore. She was walking straight into the heart of the storm, because she knew, deep in her soul, that she would never let the darkness take her again. Eleanor walked back towards Windcrest, the town barely visible in the distance, hidden beneath the veil of the darkened sky. The weight of the night seemed to hang heavy on her, but there was a strange clarity in her steps. The road clarity in her steps. Ahead was uncertain, clouded with the inevitable return of the darkness, but she was no longer running from it. She had learned to live with it. She had learned to live with it. She had learned that it could be controlled, and that made all the difference. The whispers had quieted, but they were still there. Faint echoes in the back of her mind, just beyond her reach. She could hear them, but she didn't let them define her anymore. The curse wasn't her enemy. It was something that had always been a part of her, something she could use. The fight wasn't about defeating the darkness. It was about embracing it. Windcrest was still as she entered the town. The streets were empty, quiet, as if the town itself was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. But there was no panic, no urgency, just silence. Eleanor moved through the streets, her mind focused, her heart steady. She had to find the others. They had to know what she had learned, what was coming, and what she had to face. The town hall, the center of it all, was the place where everything had started. It was where the darkness had first made itself known, where the curse had first been awakened. But now, the town hall was empty. Its windows shattered. Its windows shattered. Its windows shattered. Its windows shattered. Doors ajar, as though it too was waiting inside. It was darker than usual. The familiar musty smell of old wood and forgotten memories hanging in the air. Eleanor walked past the wreckage, ignoring the debris scattered across the floor, her footsteps echoing through the empty hall. Her eyes scanned the room, seeking something, anything, that might tell her what to do next. And then, at the far side of the room, she saw it. A small, weathered book was open on the altar. Its small, weathered book was open on the altar. It's in the... A small, pages yellowed with age, its cover adorned with strange symbols that seemed to pulse with a dim, flickering light. Eleanor felt an almost magnetic pull towards it, as though the book were calling to her. She moved toward it, her fingers toward it, hovering above the pages, hesitant but compelled. As her hand brushed the book, a wave of cold energy rushed through her, the kind of cold that came from deep within, from somewhere that didn't belong to the world around her. The shadows flickered in the corners of the room, their shapes twisting like smoke, and Eleanor could feel the presence of something ancient, something powerful stirring in the darkness. "You have come far, Eleanor." The voice was no longer in her head. It was spoken aloud, deep and resonant, filling the room with its power. Eleanor turned quickly, but there was no one there. The voice, though, continued, as if it were part of the very air around her. "The curse has been awakened. You cannot stop it now, but you can choose how it shapes you." Eleanor's heart raced, her hands trembling as the words echoed in her mind. The voice was familiar, yet different from anything she had heard before. It wasn't the figure from the streets, or the whispers that had plagued her thoughts. This was something else, something that had been waiting, something ancient. She stepped closer to the book, her gaze locked on the strange symbols inscribed on its pages. Something in those symbols, something alive. The energy they radiated felt like a living thing, coiling in the air, wrapping around her, pulling her in. As she opened the book, the words leapt off the pages, filling her mind with visions of Thalia's past, the origins of the curse, the people who had once been trapped by it, the dark rituals that had bound them all to the town. She saw the figures of the past, their faces twisted in agony, their lives consumed by the darkness. The curse was old, older than she had ever realized, and it wasn't just about Windcrest. It was about something much larger, something that reached back through the ages, to the very roots of the earth itself. The pages flipped on their own, each one revealing a new vision, a new piece of the puzzle, until the final page came into view. It was a diagram, drawn in ink that seemed to shift and move as her eyes traced the lines. There, in the center of the page, was a single, pulsing symbol, a dark, twisting mark, familiar and yet foreign. The symbol was an intricate web, reaching outward, its tendrils touching everything, every soul, every shadow, every breath of wind. "It is not over," the voice echoed again, this time louder, almost triumphant. "It is only beginning. And you, Eleanor, are at the heart of it." She slammed the book shut, the force of the movement sending a shudder through the room. The light from the feather in her hand flared brightly, pushing back the shadows, but the pull of the curse was still there, deep within her, like a hunger that would never be satisfied. She had learned what she needed to know, but the knowledge came with a heavy cost. The curse was alive. It was alive, inside her, inside Windcrest, inside the very fabric of the town. It wasn't something that could be destroyed. It had always been here, always would be, and now. She had to control it, not fight it, not run from it, with a final, steadying breath. Eleanor turned toward the door. The curse would rise again. It would always rise again. But she wasn't afraid. She had the light. And she had the will to fight, for as long as the darkness returns. "I will be ready." Eleanor stepped out of the town hall, the weight of the knowledge she had just uncovered pressing heavily on her chest. The town of Windcrest felt more suffocating than ever, as though the very air she breathed was thick with the curse that had been awakened. It wasn't just a force that lingered in the shadows anymore. It was a part of the town itself, and it was inside her. The wind had picked up again, swirling through the streets like an ominous warning. Eleanor turned her face into the breeze, feeling the chill on her skin. She felt the pull of the darkness, an unspoken invitation, a lure to give in, to let it take control, but she had fought too hard to get this far. She wasn't going to surrender now. The whispering voices were faint, but they were there, in her mind, in the air. You can't fight what you are. You'll never be free. She clenched her fists, feeling the energy of the feather still pulsing weakly in her hand. The light wasn't gone, but it had dimmed. It was as if it too was struggling to stay strong against the weight of the curse. Eleanor knew she couldn't do this alone. She needed help. The town had changed, and so had she. The darkness was everywhere now, woven into the very fabric of the town, its presence undeniable. There had to be others, people who had felt the pull of the curse before. They might have answers, or at the very least, they could help her understand what was happening. Her thoughts turned to the people she had met during her journey, the ones who had helped her when she needed it most. Gabriel, the old historian who had warned her about the curse, and Amelia, the woman who had shown her the hidden paths beneath Windcrest. They knew more about the town's history than anyone else. They might be able to help her figure out how to truly control the darkness, how to bind it to her will, instead of letting it consume her. She made her way to Gabriel's house first. His small cottage on the edge of town was always warm, filled with the scent of old books and the faint hum of knowledge. But as she reached the door, she froze. There was something off, something wrong about the air around the cottage. The door was ajar, swaying gently in the breeze. Eleanor felt the hairs on the back of her neck stand up. She stepped forward cautiously, pushing the door open with a quiet creak. The inside was dark, the shelves of books casting long, eerie shadows against the walls. The airy shadows against the walls smelled stale, like dust and something else. Something she couldn't place, but it sent a chill crawling down her spine. "Gabriel," Eleanor called softly, stepping into the room. There was no response. Eleanor's breath quickened as she stepped further into the cottage. The silence was oppressive, suffocating. She could feel the shadows creeping along the floor, pulling at her, but she forced herself to ignore it. She couldn't afford to be distracted. She needed to find answers. Her eyes scanned the room, landing on the desk where Gabriel usually worked. There, in the center of the cluttered surface, was an open book. Its pages were yellow and old, covered in symbols she didn't recognize. The book wasn't one Gabriel had used before. This one felt darker. Eleanor moved toward it, her hand reaching for the pages. As soon as her fingers brushed the edge, the ground beneath her feet shook. A low rumble vibrated through the room, and the air grew thick with tension. She stumbled back, her breath catching in her throat. The book snapped shut, and the room went silent. But then, in the corner of her vision, she saw it. A shadow, longer than the one cast by the flickering candlelight, slowly moving across the floor. It was the shadow of a figure, tall, cloaked, with glowing eyes that seemed to pierce through the darkness. "Eleanor," the figure whispered, its voice cold and hollow, like the wind itself. "You've come far, but you will never control what is already inside you." Her heart raced. The voice. It was the same voice she had heard before. The voice of the curse, of the entity that had been whispering in her mind, that had followed her. The figure stepped forward, its form slowly becoming clearer, though still mostly hidden in shadow. Malicious amusement. "You think you have control over the darkness, but you are its vessel, its home. It belongs to you, just as you belong to it." Eleanor's eyes flickered toward the door, but she couldn't bring herself to run. Instead, stood still, facing the figure with as much resolve as she could muster. The figure laughed softly, but it wasn't a laugh of humor. It was cold, calculating. "You learn, Eleanor," the figure continued. "The curse is not something you can escape. It is within you. And the darkness has only just begun to wake." The figure's form flickered and blurred, its outline shifting as if it were made of smoke. Eleanor stepped back, her mind racing. She had to do something, anything. She had to do something, anything. Couldn't face this alone. Before she could act, the figure seemed to dissipate, vanishing into the shadows that had surrounded it. The silence returned, but now it was deeper, more oppressive than before. The darkness was closer. It was as if the very air was thick with it, pressing down on her. Eleanor knew she had to leave. She couldn't stay here. She wasn't ready to face whatever that figure was. She needed more time, more strength, as she turned to leave. The whispers returned. More urgent now, more desperate. "You are the curse. You cannot run from yourself." But she refused to listen. She had learned that much. She would not be consumed. Not today. She stepped out of Gabriel's cottage and into the night, the weight of her decision settling on her shoulders. She wasn't running anymore. She was finding her path, one step at a time, no matter how dark it became. The curse would return, but so would she, and this time she would be ready. Eleanor made her way through the streets of Windcrest, her steps quick but deliberate. The weight of the encounter at Gabriel's cottage still hung over her, like a shadow that refused to fade. The figure, the voice, it was clear now that the darkness was not just an external force, but something much more insidious, something that had been a part of her all along. And no matter how much she fought it, it would always be there. The wind had picked up again, swirling around her like 1,000 whispered voices. The town felt different now, its quiet streets ominous rather than peaceful. Each corner seemed to hide more shadows than the last, and each step she took felt like it brought her closer to something she couldn't quite see, but knew was waiting. She turned a corner, her mind racing with thoughts of the book she had found. The symbols, the ancient words. There was something in that book, something she still didn't fully understand, but she was certain it held the answers to what had truly been awakened in Windcrest. The darkness was ancient, older than the town itself, and it wasn't just tied to her. It was tied to the land. Her thoughts were interrupted by the faint sound of footsteps behind her. She stopped dead in her tracks, her breath catching in her throat. She glanced over her shoulder but saw no one. The street was empty, save for the shadows that seemed to stretch and bend in the dim light of the street lamps. The footsteps stopped as well, and she snapped as well, and she couldn't shake the feeling that she wasn't alone. "Gabriel?" she called out hesitantly, but no answer came. The air around her seemed to shift, the shadows gathering closer. It wasn't just a sense of paranoia. There was something real in the air, something waiting to pounce. She forced herself to move, quickening her pace as she turned toward the direction of the town's edge. She needed to find Amelia. Gabriel's warning echoed in her mind. The curse has only just begun. If there was any hope left, it would lie in understanding what had truly been unleashed. The streets began to feel smaller, more confining, as if the darkness was folding in on her. The trees along the path seemed to lean closer, their branches twisting like long, gnarled fingers reaching out to grab her. Town, once familiar and safe, was now a labyrinth of shadows and unseen threats. She needed to get to the outskirts, to the place where Amelia had taken her before, where the old records and hidden journals had led to the truth about Windcrest. She couldn't stop now. She was almost there when a soft, hollow voice whispered through the wind, its words clear in her mind despite the distance. "You can't run, Eleanor." Her heart skipped a beat as the voice seemed to circle around her, a dark cloud hanging over her. She whipped around, but again saw nothing. There were no shadows, no figures standing in the alleyways, just the same empty street. But she could feel it. It was there. She was not alone. The voice continued, growing stronger, more insistent. "You think you can fight it. You think you can control what is already inside you. But you are wrong, Eleanor. The darkness will consume you. It will take everything from you, as it has taken from you. As it has taken from you so many before." She tightened her grip on the feather, her mind racing as she searched for the source of the voice, but it felt like the words were coming from everywhere at once. The street around her grew colder, and she could see her breath, mist in the air. She wasn't sure if it was the cold of the night, or the cold of the curse slowly sinking into her skin. "No," she whispered, shaking her head. She wasn't going to give in to the whispers. Not again. But then, from the corner of her eye, she saw a flicker of movement. She turned, but all she could see was a flash of something. Someone, just outside of her vision. It was gone in an instant, but it left her heart pounding in her chest. She couldn't ignore it anymore. The darkness was closing in. She turned sharply and broke into a run, her feet pounding on the pavement as she made her way toward Amelia's house. She didn't stop to look back. The whispers were growing louder now, and with each step, she felt the shadows following her, pushing her, urging her to turn, to give in. As she reached the edge of the town, the streetlights flickered, casting long shadows across her path. The woods loomed ahead, dark and foreboding. Amelia's house was on the other side of the trees. She could make it. She had to. But the closer she got, the heavier the air became, and the whispers were no longer in her head. They were all around her, real, tangible, calling her name, urging her to stop, to turn back. "Eleanor," the voice, soft and low, filled her ears like the rustle of leaves, and for a moment she felt a tug in her chest. She stopped running, the weight of the voice pressing down on her. It felt familiar, like an old memory trying to break through. "You're not meant to fight this, Eleanor. the voice said again, softer, more inviting. Come back to us. You are part of this world. You were always meant to be. Her knees felt weak, and the weight of the words sank deeper into her. The shadows around her seemed to pulse with the same energy, shifting and breathing as if alive, but she couldn't let it consume her again. She couldn't. No, she whispered again, her voice stronger this time. I am not part of this. I will not let it control me. The light in her hand flared brightly, the glow surging as she raised it high above her. She wasn't running anymore. She was standing her ground. The darkness recoiled, the shadows flickering as the flame widened of the dark carried toward the involved the near and tiny shed. Adorial Spunby, the Misiru Gorg, the dark light pushed against them. But the voice didn't stop. It was still there, still inside her head, its presence like a weight in her chest. You cannot fight yourself, Eleanor. The air crackled with tension. Eleanor felt the darkness surrounding her, but she wasn't afraid anymore. The curse was part of her, but she could control it. It wouldn't define her. It wouldn't win. With one final breath, Eleanor closed her eyes and called on the light within her. The world around within her exploded in a burst of brilliance, the shadows shrinking back, the whispers silenced for just a moment. But she knew, this fight, this war, was far from over. The brilliance of the light surged through Eleanor's chest, flooding the streets, pushing the shadows back and illuminating the dark forest that loomed before her. She stood firm, her feet planted on the ground, as the darkness recoiled, swirling and writhing as though it were alive, struggling against her light. The whispers were quieter now, but they still lingered, like a distant echo, clawing at her mind. She had won this moment. She had forced the darkness to retreat. But it was only temporary. It always had been. Her hand trembled. The light trembled. The light from the feather flickering, its power waning as the silence of the night crept back in. The curse hadn't been destroyed. It was still inside her, lurking, patient, waiting. Eleanor knew this was just the beginning of something far more dangerous. The force that had claimed her was ancient, and it would come again, perhaps stronger than before. But now she had the strength to face it. She understood it. She could control it. She turned toward the edge of the forest. She turned toward the edge of the forest. The dark trees casting long shadows under the moonlight. Amelia's house was close, just beyond the trees. Eleanor needed answers. She needed guidance. The book she had found at Gabriel's house had opened her eyes to the truth. But there was still so much left to understand. As she stepped into the forest, the air felt thick with tension, the quiet hum of the darkness pressing on her from every side. It was as though the woods were alive with it, watching, waiting. She could hear the soft rustling of leaves above her and the occasional snap of a twig underfoot, but otherwise it was deathly still. She quickened her pace, feeling the weight of every step, the ever-present tug of the curse pulling at her. She wanted to stop, to wing at her. She wanted to stop, to scream, but she couldn't. The only thing she could do was keep moving forward. She had to face this head-on. There was no other choice. As the trees parted, Amelia's house appeared in the distance, nestled at the edge of the woods. Cottage was barely visible under the thick canopy of trees, but the lights were on in the windows. Eleanor's heart lifted at the sight. Amelia would know what to do. She would help her understand what was happening. The darkness, the curse, everything. But as she approached the house, something felt wrong. The air around her seemed to thicken, and the faintest scent of decay lingered in the breeze. She slowed, her steps hesitant. There was no sound coming from inside. No, why? How? No, God, movement. Eleanor reached the front door, her hand trembling as she reached for the handle. But before she could touch it, the door creaked open on its own, the hinges groaning as it swung wide. The house was dark, the usual warmth of the cottage replaced by an oppressive cold that made her shiver. "Amelia?" Eleanor called, stepping cautiously inside. The silence answered her. She moved further into the house, her footsteps echoing on the wooden floor. The smell of dust and something darker lingered in the air, a sour, metallic scent that made her stomach churn. She could feel the darkness inside the house. It was there, pressing in on her from every corner. "Amelia?" she called again, but there was no response. She reached the main room, her eyes scanning the familiar space. The shelves of books lined the walls, the cozy furniture untouched, but the atmosphere was off. It felt cold and abandoned. Her heart began to race. That's when she saw it. At the far end of the room, in front of the fireplace, was a figure, dark and tall, standing perfectly still. Eleanor froze, her blood running cold as she recognized the shape of the figure. It was the same figure she had seen before, the one that had haunted her steps since the moment the curse had taken root in her. "You shouldn't have come back, Eleanor." The voice was deep and cold, the same as it had been when she had faced the figure in the streets, but now it was different, stronger, more commanding. Eleanor stepped back, her hand instinctively going to the feather, but before she could raise it, the figure moved. It was impossibly fast, a blur of it or of his he could faring nigh. Raising it was impossibly fast, a blur of shadows that seemed to stretch across the room toward her. "You are too weak to fight this." The figure's voice rang out, now closer, its presence overwhelming. "You have come far, but you will never control the curse. It is part of you, and you will fall to it in the end." Eleanor could feel it, the pressure of the curse closing in on her, the weight of the darkness pushing her to the ground. She couldn't let it happen. Not like this. With a surge of willpower, she raised the feather, the light pulsing again, this time brighter and more powerful than ever before. The figure recoiled, its form flickering as the light pushed against it. The shadows in the room hissed, retreating from the light, but the figure stood, its ground, unyielding. "You can fight all you want, Eleanor," the figure snarled, "but the darkness is a part of you now, and there is no escaping what you have become." Eleanor gritted her teeth, her hand gripping the feather tightly as she shed the cold. Her hand gripping the feather tightly as she stepped forward, not backing down. "I control it," she said, her voice steady despite the fear in her chest. "The darkness will not take me again." The figure's eyes glowed brighter, its smile widening, but Eleanor didn't falter. She focused on the light, letting it surge within her, filling her body, pushing back against the shadows. She wouldn't let it take her, not again. For the first time, she felt the light fuse with the darkness. It wasn't about banishing the curse, it was about finding balance. The figure screamed, its form dissolving into the shadows as the light erupted from Eleanor's body, filling the room, sweeping through the house. The air grew warmer, and the darkness receded, retreating back into the corners. When the light finally faded, Eleanor stood alone, the house once again quiet, but no longer suffocating. The curse hadn't been destroyed, but she had controlled it. For now, she was in control. Eleanor stood in the middle of Amelia's cottage, the pulse of the light still lingering in the air like a soft hum. The shadows had retreated, but she knew that wasn't the end of it. The darkness hadn't been defeated. It had merely been pushed back, but for the first time, she felt a sense of calm that had eluded her for so long. The power was hers. The curse was hers too, but now it no longer controlled her. She took a deep breath, trying to steady herself, as the room around her slowly returned to its familiar state. The shelves of books, the old furniture, the flickering fireplace, everything was the same. But nothing felt the same anymore. The weight of what she had learned, of what she had become, pressed down on her. The curse was part of her, now part of who she was, and no matter what she did, it always would be. But it wasn't her enemy. It was something she could control, something she could use, but the question still lingered in her mind. For how long? She turned to the front door, her heart heavy with the knowledge that her journey wasn't over. Amelia wasn't here, and for a moment, Eleanor allowed herself to wonder where she could be. But her thoughts quickly turned to the greater question at hand. What was happening in Windcrest? What was this curse truly doing to the town, to its people? And more importantly, how far did its reach go? The figure's words echoed in her mind. The curse is a part of you now, and there is no escaping what you have become. She couldn't shake the feeling that the battle was far from over. The figure had been right about one thing. It wasn't just about Windcrest, or the town hall, or the shadows in the streets. The curse was woven into the very fabric of everything around her, everything she had known. And now that she was a part of it, she could feel its pull, its influence growing stronger with every passing day. With a deep breath, Eleanor turned and walked toward the door. The cool night air met her as she stepped outside, the wind brushing against her face. The town felt quieter now, the stillness heavier than before. The shadows were waiting, watching, but she wasn't afraid anymore. The darkness was no longer something she feared. It was something she understood, and that gave her strength. She needed to find answers. There was more to this curse. There was more to this curse than she could comprehend, and she wouldn't stop until she uncovered the truth. Eleanor made her way through the quiet streets, the eerie calm of Windcrest, now thick with a sense of urgency. She had to keep moving. The darkness was still out there, waiting, but it wasn't just a physical presence anymore. It was in her. It was in her. It was inside her, and it was part of who she was now. She had to learn how to live with it, how to use it. The more she thought about it, the more she realized that the town was only a part of something much bigger. The curse had its roots here, in Windcrest, but it spread deeper than the ground beneath her feet. She felt it now, the pull of something ancient, something vast. It had always been there. The town was just the beginning, and she was the key. She reached the edge of town and looked out at the dark forest beyond. The trees loomed like silent sentinels, their twisted branches reaching toward the sky. It was the heart of the curse, the place where everything had started, and now it was where she would have to go. She didn't know what lay ahead, but she knew that the answers, her answers, were buried there. Her feet carried her toward the forest, her body moving on its own, as if she had already made the decision to face whatever waited in the shadows. The night felt colder now, the air thick with anticipation. The darkness was swirling around her, but it didn't feel threatening anymore. It was a part of her, a part of her world. And for the first time, Eleanor wasn't afraid of it. The trees parted as she entered the forest, the path winding through the thick underbrush. It was darker here, the moonlight barely filtering through the canopy of branches. Overhead, the whispers were louder now, and this time they didn't come from inside her head. They were coming from the trees, from the very earth beneath her feet. Eleanor. The voice was soft, but it was unmistakable. The figure, the voice was soft, but it was unmistakable. The figure. The one who had been haunting her every step, the voice of the curse. You cannot hide from what you are. Her heart raced. But she didn't stop. She had already made the choice. She was choosing to face this, to take control of what had been inside her for so long. The darkness would never leave her, but it didn't have to be her enemy. You will never be free, the voice continued, its tone no longer a whisper, but a cold declaration. The curse has claimed you are ours. Eleanor paused for a moment, letting the words wash over her. She could feel the weight of them, the truth in them. But she wouldn't back down. Not now. She closed her eyes and whispered to herself, I control it more. Its warmth flooding her chest as she summoned the energy, the power to fight. She wasn't running. She wasn't hiding, stood still. The curse had not gone, but it had been pushed back. For now, she was in control, and she would keep it that way. Eleanor stood at the edge of the dark forest, the full weight of her role as the vessel of the curse settling in her role as the vessel of the curse settling in her chest. She had accepted the truth. The darkness was part of her, but it wouldn't consume her. Not now, not ever again. The wind picked up, and the trees swayed gently, as if in silent agreement. There was still much to be done. The curse, still much to be done. The curse wasn't over, but she would be ready. Eleanor stood motionless, feeling the weight of the forest around her, the hum of energy still pulsing within her, echoing from the depths of the curse. The darkness had not claimed her, not this time, but darkness had not claimed her, not this time, but she knew it was waiting, biding its time. It would return. It always did. But for now, she was in control. With a deep breath, she turned and began to walk deeper into the forest. Each step was resolute, each breath a reminder of the light inside her. She had made peace with the curse, or at least, she had made peace with the fact that it was part of her, part of the path she now had to walk. The whispers had quieted, but the tension still hung thick in the air, like an invisible fog that pressed down on everything. As she moved further, the forest grew denser, the trees closing in on her, their twisted branches casting dark, tangled shadows across the path. But Eleanor wasn't afraid. She had faced the heart of the darkness already. She knew what lay ahead, and she wasn't turning back. The answers she needed were here, in the forest, in the deep roots of the curse that had bound Windcrest for so long. She could feel the pull growing stronger as she moved deeper into the woods. It was subtle at first, just a whisper at the back of her mind. But then it grew louder, more insistent. The ground beneath her feet seemed to shift, the shadows more alive, more tangible, like they were worse. Reaching out for her, Eleanor, the voice came again, sharp and insistent, cutting through the silence of the forest. It was unmistakable. The figure, the entity that had spoken to her before, the one that had warned her that she could never escape what she had become. Eleanor stopped, her heart pounding in her chest, but she didn't look back. She had faced the darkness before. She would face it again. She clenched her fists, her mind steady, her breath slow. You cannot steady. Her breath slow. You cannot hide from what you are, Eleanor. The voice was closer now, not just in her mind, but in the very air around her. It was cold, invasive, like the wind itself was carrying the words to her ears. But Eleanor stood still. She wouldn't run. Not anymore. I don't need to hide. She spoke aloud, her voice steady, as if she were speaking to herself as much as to the figure. You are a part of me, but you don't control me. The shadows around her shifted, rippling with a sudden force. The ground trembled beneath her feet, as if the forest itself were reacting to her words. The figure appeared before her, stepping out from the darkness, its form tall and imposing, cloaked in shadow. Its eyes glowed with a dull, sickly light, and its presence seemed to warp the very air around them. You misunderstand, Eleanor. The figure's voice was soft, dangerous. You were chosen for this. The curse is you. It is not something you can fight, not something you can control. It has been in you since the moment you were born. Eleanor's pulse raced, but she stood her ground. She had accepted the curse. She had learned to live with it, to control it. No, I choose how I fight this. You don't define me. The figure's face twisted, a flicker of something almost like amusement passing across its features. You cannot escape your fate. The curse has taken root in you. Its voice became colder, more threatening. You can fight it. You can fight it. But it will never end, Eleanor. You cannot fight what you truly are. The shadows around her surged forward, like a wave crashing against the shore. But Eleanor raised her hand, her eyes focused on the figure in front of her. The light inside her flared stronger this time, pushing against the encroaching darkness. The light was her power. It was the one thing the darkness could never take from her. I am not defined by you. I will not let you control me. Eleanor's voice was firm, the words cutting through the air like a blade. The figure recoiled, the shadows retreating, but only slightly. It wasn't defeated, not yet. Eleanor could feel it, the presence of the curse, the weight of the battle still pressing on her, the knowledge that this was far from over. But this time, she didn't feel the same fear she had before. This time, she knew what she was capable of. She had the light inside her, and she would keep fighting. With every ounce of her strength, she pushed the light forward, watching as it expanded, filling the space between her and the figure, flooding the dark forest with a brightness that made the shadows writhe. The figure's form flickered, its eyes narrowing, but it didn't move. You may fight for now, Eleanor, the figure said, its voice a low hiss. But the darkness will return. It will always find you. Eleanor stepped forward, unwavering, her hand still raised, the light flickering but strong. Let it come. The figure's eyes burned brighter, but Eleanor didn't hesitate. The battle wasn't over, not by a long shot. But she wasn't afraid, not anymore. The curse was part of her, yes, but it wouldn't own her. Not today. The figure's face form began to fade, the shadows evaporating into the air like smoke, but the presence of the darkness remained, lingering on the edge of her consciousness. It wasn't over. It would never be over. But Eleanor was ready. As long as the light was within her, she would fight. Eleanor stood in the heart of the forest, her breath steadying as the figure disappeared into the shadows, leaving only the faintest trace of its presence lingering in the air. The trees, once suffocating with darkness, seemed to breathe more freely, the pressure in the atmosphere lifting slightly. But she knew better than to think the fight was over. The curse hadn't been vanquished. It had been pushed back, and it would return, just as the figure had promised. But this time, Eleanor wasn't afraid. She had faced it, stared it down, and stood her ground. The darkness was a part of her, but it wasn't all of her. The light inside her was hers to command, and she wouldn't let it fade. But there was something else, a gnawing uncertainty that she couldn't shake. The figure's words echoed in her mind. You were chosen for this. The curse is you. You cannot fight what you truly are. She took a deep breath, the forest around her, still and quiet. She couldn't let those words take root. She had a purpose now. She had a responsibility to the town, to herself, to control the curse and keep it at bay. But how? How could she really keep it contained? And what if it was already too late? Her thoughts were interrupted by a rustling sound behind her. She spun around, her pulse quickening, but it wasn't the figure. It was something else, something she hadn't anticipated. Amelia, the woman, appeared in the clearing, her silhouette emerging from the shadows. Eleanor's heart skipped a beat, a sense of relief washing over her. Amelia was the one person who could help her make sense of all of this. The curse, the darkness, everything. Amelia! Amelia, Eleanor called, her voice full of a mix of hope and fear. Amelia stepped forward, her face still obscured by the shadows. But as she moved into the moonlight, Eleanor saw the exhaustion in her eyes, the weight of something heavy on hers, the weight of something heavy on hers shoulders. Eleanor, Amelia said softly, her voice low, almost a whisper. You shouldn't be here. Eleanor frowned, her brow furrowing in confusion. What do you mean? I need you, Amelia. I don't understand what's happening. What's going on in this town? What's going on with me? Amelia sighed, her expression unreadable. She reached into the folds of her cloak, pulling out a worn leather pouch. She opened it carefully, revealing a small, delicate crystal, one Eleanor recognized from earlier when she had first visited the Amelia. It was the same crystal she had seen in the journal, in the ancient texts, the one that had glowed when they had tried to summon the light. You shouldn't have touched it, Amelia said softly, almost regretfully. Eleanor's chest tightened. What are you talking about? The curse, the darkness? Amelia's eyes met hers, and for the first time, Eleanor saw the weight of the burden Amelia had been carrying. The same uncertainty, the same fear that had been growing in her since she first set foot in Windcrest. The curse wasn't meant to be broken, Amelia said. You've awakened something, Eleanor, and the town. It's already beginning to change. Eleanor's heart sank. No, this can't be happening. What do you mean? She asked, her voice barely a whisper. Amelia stepped closer, her gaze darkening. The darkness, the curse, was never something that could be destroyed. It was never meant to be. It's tied to this land, to this town, breaking it. It didn't stop. It only awakened something deeper. It's been dormant for centuries, but now it's alive, and it's more powerful than you can imagine. Eleanor felt the weight of those words hit her like a ton of bricks. She had thought she could control it. She had thought that by understanding it, by confronting it, she could make it stop. But she hadn't. She had only stirred something much worse. It's inside of you, Eleanor. It's in this land, in the soil, the trees, the very air we breathe. It's been waiting for someone like you to come along and awaken it. Amelia's voice trembled with the burden of the truth. You can't fight it. You can't escape it. You are part of it now. Eleanor felt her heart shatter in her chest. The truth of it hit her all at once. She was never going to be free. The curse had already claimed her. And now it wasn't just her fight. It was the fight for Windcrest itself. What do we do? Eleanor whispered, the weight of responsibility crushing her. She had no answers. She didn't know what to do next. Amelia looked at her, her face full of sorrow. There is only one way, Eleanor. We have to face it, together. The curse can't be stopped by one person. It's something that takes every bit of us. We need to understand it fully, harness it, and then we can fight it. We need to bring together the ones who are still tied to this town, the ones who have felt its power, the ones who can help us seal it away. But it's going to take everything we have. Eleanor nodded, her determination slowly returning. She had never been one to shy away from a fight. She had fought the darkness before, and she could do it and she could do it again. But this time, it wouldn't just be her. She couldn't carry this burden alone. Amelia's voice was steady now. You may have awakened it, Eleanor, but you are not alone in this. The town will stand with you. We will all stand with you. Together, they would face the curse. Together, They would learn to control it, to push it back, to make sure it never consumed Windcrest again. Eleanor's hand tightened around the feather, the light inside her growing brighter. She wasn't giving up. She couldn't. Eleanor felt the weight of Amelia's words settle in her heart. But there was a flicker of hope among the darkness. They weren't alone in this fight. Together, they would face what had been awakened. They had to. Amelia reached out, placing a hand on Eleanor's arm, grounding her in the moment. The world around them seemed to hold its breath, the shadows still lingering at the edge of the forest, waiting. "We need to gather the others," Amelia said, her voice steady, but there was a hint of urgency in it. "The people who are still connected to the curse, who can help us understand it. We need to know how to truly seal it away, not just fight it." Eleanor nodded, a deep sense of fight purpose settling over her. She had felt the curse every moment of her life, first as a whisper in her mind, then as a shadow in the streets. Now, she understood. It was more than a curse. It was a bond, a force that had been tied to Windcrest for centuries, and if they didn't stop it, it would never let go. "Where do we start?" Eleanor asked, her voice steady. Amelia hesitated, her eyes distant for a moment, as though she were looking for something beyond the forest. "We need to go to the old chapel. It's hidden in the woods, forgotten by most, but it's where the first ritual was performed. The one that bound the curse to the town. It's the key. If we can find the altar and the symbols, we might be able to understand more of what we're up against." The air around them grew colder, a sign that the darkness was never far, waiting, watching. Eleanor shivered, but she held her ground. She was ready. She had to be. The two of them moved quickly through the forest, the trees towering above them, their branches twisting like gnarled hands. The path Amelia led them down felt unfamiliar, despite Eleanor's time in Windcrest. The town's secrets had always been hidden beneath the surface, but tonight, it felt as if the very land itself was drawing them deeper into its grip after what felt like an eternity. The trees opened up to reveal a clearing, bathed in moonlight. In the center, surrounded by wild ivy and tangled undergrowth, stood the chapel. It was a small, ancient building, its stone walls cracked and weathered by centuries of time. Vines crept up the sides, nearly obscuring the faded carvings etched into the stone. The air was thick here, a lingering weight that Eleanor could feel deep in her chest. "This is it," Amelia whispered, her eyes scanning the chapel with reverence. "This is where it all began. The curse, the ritual, everything." They stepped closer, their footsteps quiet against the overgrown grass. The door to the chapel creaked open as though it had been waiting for them. Inside, the thick space was filled with shadows, the flickering light from Eleanor's feather casting long, distorted shapes against the walls. In the center of the chapel, there was a stone altar. The symbols carved into it were familiar, just like the ones in the familiar book Eleanor had found. But there was something more. As she approached, the air around her seemed to hum, as though the symbols on the altar were alive, pulsing with ancient energy. Amelia stepped forward and placed her hand on the altar. "This is where the ritual took place. This is where the curse was born." Eleanor moved closer, her hand hovering over the symbols. She felt the darkness within her stir, a low, insistent whisper that tugged at her thoughts. She couldn't listen to it. She wouldn't. "What exactly happened here?" Eleanor asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Amelia looked up at her, her face shadowed with the weight of years of knowledge. "Long ago, the people of Windcrest made a pact. They summoned a dark power, one that would bind their fates to the land. They didn't understand the price. The curse wasn't something they could control. It was the land that became cursed, not just the people. The ritual tied them to it, to the darkness, to the very earth beneath their feet. The more they earth beneath their feet tried to escape, the more it consumed them, and then they tried to bury it. Eleanor looked at the altar, the symbols now glowing faintly under her touch. She could feel the power of it, the connection to the curse that still clung to this place, to this land. But there was something else, something beyond the darkness, a thread of light, faint but undeniable, running through the stone. "What's this?" she murmured, her fingers tracing one of the symbols. The light pulsed in response, almost as if it were alive. This is different from the curse." Amelia stepped forward, her face filled with both awe and concern. "That's what we've been searching for. The light that can counter the darkness, it's tied to the curse, but it's also what can defeat it." Eleanor's pulse quickened. "Then why hasn't it been used? Why didn't they use it to stop the curse?" Amelia sighed, the weight of the truth sinking into the silence around them. "Because it's tied to the very heart of Windcrest. The light can only be wielded by someone who understands the curse completely. It can't be used until you know how to control it, how to harness both the light and the darkness, and that's why you're the one who's been chosen. Eleanor, the curse is part of you, and so is the light." Eleanor's hand hovered over the glowing symbols. She felt the warmth in her palm, the flicker of light that connected her to everything. The land, the town, the curse, and herself. The darkness was a part of her. Yes, but so was the light. With a deep breath, she spoke, nodded, a faint smile on her lips. Together, as they both placed their hands on the altar, the symbols flared to life, lighting up with a brilliant, blinding energy. The ground beneath them trembled as the light and darkness intertwined, both powerful forces fighting for dominance. But Eleanor could feel it now. She wasn't fighting the curse. She was controlling it. The light surged forward, pushing the darkness back as the very earth beneath their feet seemed to come alive, responding to their touch. The forest around them shook, but this time, it wasn't the forest of shadows. It was the land of life fighting back, and in that moment, Eleanor knew this was just the beginning. The battle was far from over, but she was ready. The light that surged from the altar was blinding, overwhelming, yet steady. Eleanor stood firm, her hands still pressed against the stone, the pulse of the power flowing through her veins. She could feel the light and the darkness inside her, like two opposing forces, neither willing to surrender. But she wasn't afraid anymore. She wasn't just the darkness. She was the balance between it. The ground beneath her feet began to shake more violently, and the walls of the chapel groaned under the pressure. The trees outside twisted in the wind, their branches reaching toward the sky as if they were trying to grasp something unseen. The air was thick with energy, crackling and vibrating, the balance of thick with energy, the balance of the curse teetering on the edge of oblivion. Amelia stood beside her, her face lit with a quiet resolve. "It's working," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the tremors. Eleanor closed her eyes, focusing on the surge of power within her. She could feel the curse, like a dark, heavy weight, but now it was different. It wasn't just inside her. It was fighting against the light, pushing and pulling, its tendrils trying to reclaim its tiny hold. But she could feel the light growing stronger, pushing back, stabilizing the energy, forcing the curse to retreat. And then, something clicked. The darkness recoiled, as if it recognized the inevitable. It couldn't overpower the light anymore. The land, the very essence of Windcrest, responded to the change. The shadows that had once enveloped the town began to dissipate, shrinking, withering away like smoke in the wind. The altar before them flared brighter than ever before, and the symbols etched into its surface began to glow, burning with a fierce light. The ground rumbled one final time, and the chapel itself seemed to breathe, expanding with a deep, resonant pulse. And then, all at once, it won. All at once, it stopped. The world was still. Eleanor opened her eyes, her breath shallow, but steady. The light in her hand was dimming, but the glow still lingered, like a gentle warmth that had taken root deep inside her, retreated, but not destroyed. It wasn't gone, but it was no longer in control. Amelia stepped back, her eyes filled with a mixture of awe and relief. "We did it?" she said softly. "We've sealed it," Eleanor nodded, though she couldn't shake the feeling that the curse wasn't truly gone. It had merely been contained, pushed back. The town was safe, for now, but the darkness was always patient. It would wait, and when the time was right, it would come again. But Eleanor wasn't afraid anymore. She had faced the curse and learned that it didn't have to define her. The power to control it was within her, and as long as she stood firm, as long as she chose to fight, it would never take her again. "What now?" Eleanor asked, turning to Amelia, the weight of their victory settling in her chest. Amelia smiled softly. "Now we rebuild. Together. We've removed the hold the curse had on Windcrest. It will take time, but the town will heal. The darkness will fade, and we'll stand strong, knowing that we have the power to keep it away." Eleanor's heart lightened. The battle wasn't over. It would never be, but she had learned something vital. The curse was part of her, but it didn't own her. The darkness was something she could control, something she could face, and she wouldn't let it claim her again. She looked around the chapel, the ancient walls now quiet, free from the oppressive weight they had once carried. The air once carried felt different, lighter, as if a long-held breath had finally been released. "We'll be ready for whatever comes next," Eleanor said, her voice steady and strong. Amelia nodded, the faintest smile crossing her lips. "Together, we will—" The last of the shadows faded. The light settled around them like a protective cloak, and Eleanor knew that for the first time in a long while, Windcrest was truly free. The end.